Hello, Ahmed. Francis.
Yes, je suis là.
Okay. Francis, you have the floor. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Arnold. Nous allons commencer notre séminaire. Merci d'être venu. Nous disons un bonjour spécial à Monsieur Ahmed Atou, qui est le directeur du financement du commerce et qui va prendre la parole pour faire l'ouverture. Monsieur Ahmed, je vous donne la parole. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Francis. Et je vous prie de m'excuser d'avoir désactivé ma caméra afin de gérer la bandwidth sur Internet. Et bonjour tout le monde, distingués participants, mesdames et messieurs. Permettez-moi, au nom de la Banque africaine de développement, de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cet atelier sur l'évolution du paysage du financement du commerce en Afrique de l'Ouest et du Centre. Je suis heureux de vous accueillir à cette rencontre dont l'organisation a été rendue possible grâce à l'étroite collaboration entre la BAD, Making Finance Work for Africa, et le Comité régional d'Afrique, de ITFA, International Trade and Forfaiting Association. Le commerce est important pour la croissance économique et la réduction de la pauvreté dans nos pays membres régionaux. L'Afrique, avec seulement 3% du commerce mondial, pourrait bénéficier d'une augmentation significative de cette part. Cependant, le déficit de financement du commerce, estimé à plus de 100 milliards de dollars par an selon les études de la BAD, limite les capacités de financement pour les entreprises engagées dans le commerce international. Alors que les défis sont particulièrement aigus en Afrique de l'Ouest et du Centre, une étude de la SFI et de l'OMC révèle que le financement soutient que 25% du commerce des marchandises dans les principales économies de la CEDEAO, bien en deçà de moyenne africaine et mondiale. L'expansion du commerce international est freinée par des obstacles tels que l'accès limité aux ressources en dollars, les contraintes et exigences de la réglementation bancaire qui encadre les activités de financement de commerce. Dans un tel contexte, la Banque a été l'origine du lancement de nombreuses initiatives et de la création de plusieurs institutions régionales pour faciliter l'accès au financement du commerce sur le continent. C'est ainsi qu'elle a joué un rôle de premier plan dans la création d'institutions spécialisées dans le financement du commerce, telles que la Banque africaine d'import-export, la Exim Bank, la Banque de commerce et de développement de l'Afrique orientale et australe, TDB, et l'Agence pour l'assurance du commerce en Afrique, ATD. Depuis 2013, la BAD est activée dans ce domaine à travers le lancement du programme de financement du commerce qui offre des solutions de financement et de garantie aux banques locales africaines. À juin 2024, ce programme a contribué à soutenir plus de 12 milliards de dollars en volume de transactions liées au financement du commerce et a permis de couvrir plus de 3 000 transactions émises par 170 banques émettrices basées dans 35 pays membres régionaux. Pour revenir au sujet de notre atelier, les soucis de conformité sont désormais une source d'incertitude dans les relations de correspondance bancaire et le financement des opérations de commerce international. La complexité croissante des réglementations contre le blanchiment d'argent, le financement du terrorisme et la croissance des clients, les connaissances des clients entraînent également des coûts de conformité plus élevés. Cet atelier vise donc à sensibiliser les acteurs bancaires et ceux en charge de la conformité sur les défis actuels du financement du commerce en Afrique. Nous espérons que cela contribuera à améliorer les relations de correspondance entre les banques locales et les banques internationales. Nous saluons l'enthousiasme manifesté par cet atelier, preuve de la pertinence de son thème pour les banques en Afrique. Nous remercions nos partenaires Exim Bank, Atlantic Financial Group, Moody's et Atex pour leur contribution à travers leur participation effective à l'animation des différentes sessions. En conclusion, j'espère que cet atelier sera l'occasion d'échanges enrichissants et d'opportunités de collaboration fructueuse pour renforcer la résilience et l'innovation dans le financement du commerce en Afrique. En vous souhaitant un excellent atelier. Je vous remercie. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Ahmed. Merci pour ces mots d'ouverture. Nous allons donc commencer. J'aimerais déjà m'introduire. Je suis Francis Kémézé, économiste à la Banque africaine de développement. Je serai votre modérateur pour ce séminaire sur le financement du commerce international. J'ai déjà beaucoup collaboré avec l'équipe du financement du commerce de la BAD. On a eu à travailler sur beaucoup de rapports et puis récemment, on a un rapport sur la demande et l'offre du financement du commerce en Afrique. Donc, je suis très enthousiaste pour ce séminaire qui va déjà parler des problèmes de risque et de conformité dont les entreprises, y compris les banques, font face dans les deux régions de l'Afrique francophone de l'Ouest et l'Afrique centrale. Je ne serai pas seul, je suis avec Monsieur Ted qui va s'introduire. À vous la parole, Monsieur Ted.
Merci beaucoup, Francis. I'm going to speak in English, but there is translation, which Francis will explain in a moment. I'm Ted George. I'm the founder and chief narrative officer of Kleos Advisory, and I am working as the ITFA secretariat for our Africa Regional Committee. And I'm delighted that we are holding this joint webinar. One of the members of the AFDB, Mo, is a member of the Africa Regional Committee of ITFA, and we'd been discussing for some time about doing a joint webinar or virtual workshop where we could bring together the different strands of our works. ITFA is the International Trade and Forfaiting Association. It is the international body for trade finance and for anyone financing or underwriting trade in Africa. And I'm delighted that we can have a focus on West Africa and Central Africa, in particular the Francophone parts. Moi, je parle français, mais je vais présenter en anglais because being English, it is easier for me, but I'm delighted to be acting as co-MC with Francis for today. So I think before we start, we should do a little bit of housekeeping. And I wonder, Francis, if you first want to talk about the translations.
Thank you, Ted. Les langues de cet atelier virtuel sont le français et l'anglais. Et il y a deux traductions en direct dans les deux langues. Veuillez, si vous pouvez, cliquer sur le lien interprétation, sur l'icône interprétation, sur votre plateforme Zoom, et vous pouvez cliquer soit sur le français, soit sur l'anglais, et en fonction de votre langue de préférence.
That's great, thanks.
Ted, juste pour aider en tout cas nos participants à retrouver l'onglet pour l'interprétation, si vous regardez en tout cas sur votre écran, tout à droite, il y a un onglet plus avec 3 points. Vous cliquez sur l'onglet et puis dans le menu déroulant, vous avez interprétation. Et si vous cliquez sur interprétation, vous avez 2 canaux d'interprétation, l'anglais et le français. Après, vous choisissez en fonction de celui qui vous convient. Merci.
Thank you. Great. And if you have any issues with that, please send a message in the chat. So the other thing to say is we have a very large number of participants today. We're delighted that there are so many online, but therefore you're on mute, your camera's off. If you want to ask a question, if you want to post a comment about the discussions, please put it in the chat or the Q&A button. All of the questions will be reviewed by the AFDB during the webinar, and we will endeavor to answer as many of them as we can at various points when we have a Q&A session. Francis.
Juste pour mentionner aussi que ce séminaire est enregistré et l'enregistrement sera disponible sur le site Making Finance Work for Africa après l'événement, ainsi que les présentations. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks, Francis. The final thing to say in housekeeping is that we are going to be doing polls online so we can get your views on the topics we are discussing and gauge the feeling of the room. So be ready for them. And why don't we start with a first poll now, just to get an idea of where everyone is joining from. So could you please put the first poll on the screen? Yes, so the first poll is, in which region of Africa are you based? Are you in Central Africa, East Africa, North Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, or like me, outside Africa? Please vote, and we'll see how many people we have and where they all are. Give you just one more moment to vote. Okay, could we please see the results on screen? Excellent. So 58% in West Africa, that is very much what we wanted as well. And very good to see that we have strong as well from Southern Africa as well, and from Central Africa, and around 14% from outside Africa. So we're very good mix. We're bringing together all the different parts of Africa and those financing or underwriting trade. So there will be other polls. Please look out for them. We'll be looking to get your views on some of the issues discussing today. So what do we have for today? If you could put up the next screen, please, of the agenda. I'll quickly go through it. Today's session is divided into 3 parts. We start off with a session which will be moderated by Francis, looking at the risks and challenges of accessing funding in the CEMAC and CEDEAO regions. This will include a presentation from Aurelian Mali from Moody's, discussion as well with Francis, and also a presentation by Mohamedou Ba on the AFDB's work with trade finance. There will then be a 10-minute break, and then I will be moderating the second session, looking at how digitalization is transforming trade finance. I will be giving a presentation looking particularly at digitalization, the current state, where we are and what is on the horizon, particularly AI. And then we will also have a presentation from Niama El Bassouni, the CEO of Ways to Cap, looking at some very specific examples of how tech is being deployed, particularly in West and Central Africa, to help traders and financiers. There will then be a final break of 10 minutes, and then the final session, moderated by Francis, will look at navigating through the challenges of compliance, which of course is one of the biggest challenges to actually getting trade finance deals out of the door. We will have presentations from Fungai Nyamahawa from Afreximbank and Kara Genzu from the Atlantic Financial Group, and also some discussion. And then at the end, we will have closing words where Francis and I will wrap up our final thoughts, and closing works from the African Development Bank and Making Finance Work for Africa. So please stay with us for the 3 different sessions. And as we said before, if you have comments or questions, please post them in the chat. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Francis for the first session.
Thank you, Todd. Merci beaucoup. Dans cette session, nous allons avoir une discussion très stimulante sur les risques et les défis d'accès au financement dans les régions francophones de l'Afrique de l'Ouest et du Centre. Le conférencier de cette session est Aurelian Mali de Moody. Aurelian est vice-président, directeur du crédit chez Moody Investor Service. Il a contribué à l'expansion de Moody en Afrique. Aurelian gère en parallèle un programme de recherche qui soutient le développement de la réputation de Moody pour l'analyse et l'excellence. Aurelian détient une licence en économie et un diplôme d'études supérieures en monnaie, finance et banque de l'université Panthéon-Sorbonne à Paris. Le déficit de financement du commerce dans les régions est significatif, avec seulement 25% des biens échangés soutenus par le financement du commerce. S'il vous plaît, Aurelian, expliquez-nous certains des risques qui pourraient expliquer un tel déficit. Je vous passe la parole, Monsieur Aurelian.
I will speak in English, but when we will have the question, and I hope we'll have a lot of questions, I will answer some of the question in French, because the presentation is written in English, so it's easier. First, let me say hello to everybody. I'm very pleased to participate with the African Development Bank on this topic. Moody's always try to explain its views, and instead of focusing really on some details, I thought that these risks and challenges of access to funding is much broader than looking just at trade, because trade is just one of the sector, but the reasons for this situation is much broader. And I will give example in the CEMAC on the WAMU zone through my presentation, so that you will see. Just before we start, I just want to say that this presentation, a little bit on me, I have 20 years plus of sovereign credit rating, and I've been at the forefront of assigning the first ratings by Moody's in the region. We rate at the moment 28 sovereign nations, more than 50 banks, and some also companies on the continent. And the financial integration of the continent is progressing every day with the rest of the world. So let's start on the presentation. If you can move on the next slide, please. So before I dive into one of the key elements of the risk and challenges of access to funding, I wanted to, if you want, explore few elements that are often overlooked. People are focused on how to make sure that a letter of credit is accessed and so on. But most of the little risks are, I would say, there are edges or solutions that exist. But there are some risks that are much more difficult to hedge against. And the first element I want to mention is that the global environment is very competitive. This is something that is often overlooked, and that can explain a lot of the weakness, if you want, of the funding. I want to remind the audience that capital inflows and outflows are very quick to shift, and investor sentiment is always something that is a risk for any jurisdiction. And in fact, the competition among all the countries to attract funding and financing is paramount to explain anything here. And the relative positioning is also key. Here, what I want to say is that anything positive or negative that can impact financial allocation of resources is important, even tiny elements. And therefore, this is the first element that I wanted to mention. By the way, the presentation will last roughly 20 minutes for people that are wondering. The second element is, anybody that invests, being a bank, a domestic agent, a foreign agent, will look at indication that if the transaction is safe. For foreign direct investment and portfolio investment, this is a part also of the questioning, but foreign investment is the investment in real, I would say, assets like mining, companies, building, manufacturing, and so on, while the portfolio investment, of course, are more linked to the stock market and the capital market. This is volatile, and the big question, especially for foreign investment and for the continent, is the foreign investment, or at least the investment in infrastructure. And I think one of the key deficiencies throughout the region is the lack of ability to invest significant investment in infrastructure. And it's true for both the domestic and the external environment. But I mentioned the foreign environment because the maturity of the lending is important for infrastructure investment. We'll come back to that later. Another element that is always underestimated, but always mentioned by all the investors, is the external vulnerability, which means that the exchange rate or the inflation volatility risk. Here, for the CEMAT and the WAMU, this risk is relatively reduced because of the peg to the euro. So the exchange rate risk is more dollar-euro exchange rate risk. And of course, the inflation volatility is mitigated by the peg. But for any other countries on the continent, this is extremely important. If you look at countries like in West Africa, like Ghana or Nigeria, with high inflation, it gives uncertainty on the terms of trade, both from the local producer, but also for the partners, external partners. And there is difficulty to find a solution to hedge. Another element that I think is absolutely key is the depth of regional and domestic financial markets, which are generally limited. There has been progress in the WAMU and the CEMAC over the last few years, where the central bank, is trying to support the development of capital market, providing also central bank liquidity. But in a sense, they are not large enough to fund the needs, not only of the government, and I will come back on this element in particular for the rest of the presentation. But generally, allocation of capital is very limited for private, agent, because of also the fact that the sovereign is calling out everybody. But this is absolutely paramount for the long term. For better allocation of capital in any jurisdiction, you need a strong domestic/regional capital market. And that weakness is explained also by the lack of strong institutional investor. The region, and it's a fact, it lacks large insurance companies, pension funds, the type of investor that can really support long-term funding that is needed in most of the countries. You have recently, at least over the last 2 decades, some examples, but given the needs and the size of the region, this is absolutely not enough to really stabilize and enhance the funding capacity. And that is explained also by the low income of the household in the region and the low saving levels. People often do not know that 80% of the savings in sub-Saharan Africa are located in South Africa alone, which explains that without large savings, you are limited de facto. One of the main elements, I think, of the challenges to access of funding is the risk perception or the elevated risk premium for the region. There are various, views. I think everybody today has his own view on how the risk in Africa is perceived. It's very important to understand that any investor or banks or whoever is lending some financial resources or investing in the region will look at various very important elements that are difficult to hedge against. I think this is the biggest probably obstacle for funding, accessing finance in the region. The first one is the governance and the institutional strength. I'm speaking in general terms here, but no, please, I need to explain that. These elements are absolutely key, changing in regulation, inability to maintain the sanctity of contracts, revision, as we see, for example, in the case of, which is a bit surprising, a country like Senegal, that in fact, all the surveillance mechanism on the deficit did not work, and in fact, the debt is much higher than what has been published for the last 5 years. These elements are really important over the long term for securing more financing over the long term in a region. The second element is the track record on the credibility. The announcement that some reforms will be done and they are not done, that fiscal consolidation will happen and it's not happening, that macroeconomic stability will be enhanced and it's not happening. All this weigh on the access to funding. Another element is the transparency. I think we underestimate how key this is and how it badly affects financing. The fact that data are always or often delayed. There is also capacity building here that is important, but the revisions in numbers, inflation numbers that sometimes are understated, and the uncertainty about even the publication of data. Now, the big elephant in the room is the political risk. I put in parentheses perception versus reality. Most of if you ask to the people in sub-Saharan Africa, they will tell you that the perception is probably exaggerated, but from external views on it, it's based on what is happening. You had so many political coup, regime change, transition with uncertainty of what is the economic policies that are going to be put in place in many countries and how it will affect even the broader stability of the region. You have long-standing regimes that are increasingly challenged by the young population that won't change. And so all this is when an investor and even a domestic investor decide to invest, they ask this question in their mind. It's a certainty. Now, linked to that, you have the default history and the contagion risk. Most of the sovereign default over the last few years occurred in Africa. From Mozambique to the technical default of Cameroon, the default of Mali and Niger following the sanctions, the default in Ghana, in Ethiopia, and so on. These elements are extremely important as a perception. And the contagion risk, it's unfortunate, but it exists. I remember, for example, when you had the Ebola crisis in West Africa, Kenya was complaining that tourism was going down because of while they are 7 kilometers away from the outbreak. But these elements are important. If a big country defaults, there is a perception from the lenders that probably it's an indication that maybe other countries are concerned. And a last element that I mentioned on this slide is the resolution framework, and it's everything that touches to the business environment. Generally, it's where people. I could have done a full presentation on that to say, if you improve the one way countries have managed to improve funding is, for example, the tribunal, the trade tribunal, or the how you manage a bankruptcy, the organization of a one-stop shop, the access to energy, and so on. All this is fine, but the point is that there is there is still plenty to do in that area to ensure or reassure that when an investment or a lending is made, it is relatively secure from the law or the lawyer's point of view, but also from the rule of law, but also from the any type of changes post signature of the contract. If you can move to next slide, the conclusion of that of the previous slide is that the sovereign influence is key on all these matters, and that's we need to look at where the African sovereign are at the moment, and because there are questions on the level of debt, they are calling out the whole private sector, and they are because of their public finances that are really deteriorated, they impact significantly the macroeconomic stability in many countries, being the inflation and also the exchange rate, and that is the slide that I'm showing you at the moment. If you take a longer perspective, in 2000, the debt was around 60% of GDP in the region, and it went down to 30 after all the initiative from the G7 debt reduction, the Paris Club, and the Multilateral Development Bank. The African Development Bank was one of the key institutions to develop the MDRI initiative, the Multilateral Debt Reduction Initiative. But the debt early 2010 was at 30% of GDP. And the problem that occurs, or at least with all the shocks and the borrowing binge, if you want, without exaggerating, means that today the debt is back to level where it was unsustainable for the region. And so it's not a surprise that we have had already some default in many sovereigns. And the important element here is that the debt has an unfavorable structure where a big chunk is in foreign currency. Of course, with the issuance of Eurobond, you have a diversification of the financing, but the reliance on the external side is still very strong. And because, again, the underdevelopment of the domestic market and the depreciation of the currency has often led to much more higher cost for the debt in many countries. I can mention Nigeria, but it's also for Ghana, and you have Angola, but this element is important. The structure of the debt as well in some of the CEMAC countries has been quite increasing significantly and followed the same patterns for many of them than in the region. That element is responsible for a lot of the challenging in terms of infrastructure development, access to funding for the private sector, and so on. Next slide, please. So when you look at the public finance, why they have deteriorated structurally, we put the fiscal consolidation in different regions, advanced economies in light blue, and Africa in dark green. And you see that post-COVID shock, the deficit remains much higher in Africa than in the rest of the world, and that element explains that these economies were, I would say, weaker in their ability to withstand the shocks, the successive shocks. You had the COVID, then you had the global energy and food shock, then you had again some of the social results or impact on the most vulnerable household, and therefore it's very difficult for government to reduce spending to consolidate their public finance. And one of the elements that is clear and that is shown on the next graph is the level of interest payment. We put the interest payment to revenue, and you see that in Africa, it moved from 4% of revenue in 2010 to 14% expected this year of their revenue. Now, many countries spend more on paying only the interest only of the debt than on education, healthcare, and so on. Hence the pressure on the overall spending of government. Can you move to the next slide? And I will accelerate. I will move very quickly, but to say that the external vulnerability, which is not the case in CEMAC and OneU, has impacted a lot. But it's still true because the level of reserve are down quite significantly, and they have just started to rebound in both zones. This element is important because the central bank cannot provide liquidity without limits to the capital market because they have a reserves to coverage ratio of the the currency of the peg that limit that. This is why you see both central banks that really indicated that now it's time to go back to the below 3% deficit. But it's true throughout the region. And inflation has also been much higher, which creates other pressure, especially to protect the most vulnerable. Next slide, please. And one of the key elements here that creates issue for everybody, and I will give one example, is the Eurobond maturities. During the period where the debt was low, a lot of countries issued Eurobonds. So you have waves of Eurobonds in the coming years throughout the regions that are coming due, that will mature and that needs to be refinanced. But at the same time, because access to funding was very relatively challenged in the last few years, many countries secured external loans that are also expensive, and therefore when you look at risk premium on the international capital market, the Africa sovereign yield is still higher than it was, pre-COVID or just after the COVID. It has not returned to, affordable in bracket level, which means that at the moment where the region needs a lot of external funding, and it's true for both CEMAC and WAMU, by the way. The issuance of Côte d'Ivoire, the recent issuance earlier this year of Côte d'Ivoire and Benin and also Senegal were very important in supporting the level of reserves in the region. For example, Cameroon as well. And they have IMF program to try to support also the reserves, but you have pressure, external pressure that are still a risk for the region. So next slide. And this is the last slide before the conclusion. So the situation of the sovereign really raises a lot of questions because it's difficult if for an investor, if you know that public finance are not in order, that you have fiscal slippage, that you have a risk of increased macroeconomic volatility, that you will increase your exposure to that jurisdiction. And this risk, you cannot hedge against them. You have to build a track record. So there are good examples in the region. For example, Côte d'Ivoire has been able to secure the funding at an effective rate that was a bit less than 630 because after swap, because it has built a long track record of managing its liability profile, and is growing, and there has been some important reforms along the way. And so the key question is how to make sure that over the medium term, public finance are improve in the region. I have no answer, but I think this is key to improve overall the allocation of funds in any jurisdiction and the attractiveness of the place. There is a need for many countries to get access to external liquidity one way or the other. By the way, the multilateral development bank, like the African Development Bank, have increased quite significantly their lending to many countries to try to alleviate that element. And one of, if the main, I would say, probably a question will be the development of domestic capital market. For the CEMAC and WAMU, I would say they're a bit better than others because you have also already the possibility for each country to access to the saving pool of other countries because the markets are integrated, and therefore it facilitates probably, but at the same time, it also increases the correlation risk when you have indication of rift between countries, like the creation of the ROS, the Alliance for the Sahel countries and others. But over the long term, the domestic capital market is one of the key issues for improving probably the allocation of capital. And the fact that sovereign debt restructuring is more challenging today is also a big question, because if the debt becomes unsustainable, you end up like Ghana, you have the need, or Ethiopia, you have the need to restructure the debt. And therefore, it stopped basically access to funding, and the whole economy is suffering because of that. So I will stop there, but it's just to set the scene, saying that yes, it's the access to funding and the challenge is important. There are a lot of elements that you can hedge against, and that there are other elements that take time, and especially for the trade, and I will stop there. My opinion is that the biggest challenge for the continent is the lack of infrastructure, on top of everything I've mentioned. So I'll stop there. Francis, back to you.
No, thank you very much, Aurélien, for this excellent and yet thought-provoking presentation, which clearly shows that sovereign risk, as you mentioned, encompassing, institutional risk, governance risk, and you just mentioned infrastructure, are really among the key risks that affect the landscape of financing in Africa. Non, permettez-moi de lancer peut-être la session questions-réponses. Déjà, nous avons lancé un petit survey autour des participants pour essayer de voir aussi leur avis sur cette question de risque. Et comme vous pouvez, je ne sais pas si vous voyez les résultats, et je suis d'accord sur cette question de sovereign risk qui entre dans le gros paquet de contre-risques. Et comme les participants mentionnent aussi, le contre-risque est vraiment le risque le plus important, et suivi par le risque de manque d'infrastructure. Donc voilà ce qui remonte vraiment à la tête des risques comme présenté. Maintenant, vous avez aussi présenté un certain nombre de risques affectant l'accès au financement, mais si vous deviez identifier le risque le plus important, et surtout beaucoup plus dans le secteur de financement du commerce, dans la zone CFA, quel serait-il et du coup, comment mieux gérer ce risque de financement?
Bon, merci Francis pour cette question. J'ai publié en 2013, donc ça fait plus de 10 ans, un papier sur le commerce. Sorry, I switched to English. I said that I will do it in English. I published a paper in 2013 on the intra-regional trade in Africa, and one of the elements that was absolutely, I would say, key was that the conclusion was that the lack of infrastructure explained the poor development of trade mostly. And the way the people look at it is that, especially in Africa, you build a trade economic zone. So you have the WAMU, you have the SADC, you have the CEMAC, you have the COMESA, and so on. You have the new continental trade agreement. But, it didn't work before. So I don't see adding another one. I don't see how it will deal with the issue. For the CEMAC and the WAMU, it's even more pronounced because they are already integrated. And everywhere else in the world, when you have an integrated with one currency, one central bank, and so on, trade is progressing faster than anywhere else. So there are structural issues. First is that the implementation of the treaty is not right. As you know, there should not be a visa restriction or in some of the region I mentioned, or even control at the border for the movement of goods or people. But it's still the case. So that's the first element. The second element, and I think this is clear, even if you want to produce and trade, if you don't have highways, ports, that function, roads, and you can evacuate properly productions, and you have also energy to have manufacturing, you cannot really secure not only the investment, but also the certainty that if you export something, it will arrive at the right time and without any difficulty. So that I see that as the main issue. I want to mention as well, because it's the numbers that we look at are probably underestimated. There is a lot of informal trade that is happening between countries. I think probably West Africa is the most sophisticated in the world, because the borders are very porous between all the countries, and we know that each time there is an arbitrage to be done on any good, immediately the networks, they start to allocate the resources between the countries to make a profit. So that exists as well and should be looked at, but we lack data to confirm, the extent. But we know, for example, that in Benin, 80% of the refined oil comes from Nigeria through smuggling, and vice versa when fertilizer are moved throughout the region and so on. So this element also explain the low numbers. They are probably better than it looks, but the lack of infrastructure, energy, and so on is key.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Aurélien. The floor is open. And see, you received some questions from the chat. I will just go ahead and ask some of those questions, while also inviting people from the room to raise their hand if they want to ask any question to Aurélien. There's a question from Felix. It's in English, so I will proceed to just asking in English. Please, how climate change is perceived as a risk challenge in the trade financing, particularly in the context of West and Central Africa? That's the question.
Yes, this is something that at Moody's we developed over the last 6 years. Now, with our credit rating, we have also climate, at least ESG exposure measured, and for all our issuers, and not just the sovereign, even banks and corporates and so on. And it's true that the region has among the highest ESG exposure. I talked about governance in my presentation, but it's true also on the social risk, and of course in the environmental risk. Physical climate risk is one of the driver, especially for countries that rely on, for most of them, on some agriculture sector of often subsistence, and therefore this is a part of the element that needs to be addressed over time. But for the moment, they weigh on, I would say, many of at least on the credit profile, but also on some of the trade. I just want to mention also very quickly on that ESG is that the most of the efforts are still to be made to, especially in infrastructure, to mitigate the impact of physical climate risk. And because, again, it's always, it seems that it's always the same element, but because the balance sheet of many governments are already very weak, they have less, I would say, capacity to address this risk. And this is why the support of the international partners is very important.
No, thank you. Is there a comparative advantage of a fixed exchange rate in trade finance? And further elaborated, despite the safer franc being pegged to the euro, fluctuation in the euro value against other currency can pose significant risk for cross-border transaction. Could the safer zone fixed exchange rate be leveraged to boost trade finance among the members country? And a related question, maybe we check both, how the free zone, the continental free zone, could mitigate this risk? Thank you.
I'll start with the second. The continent free zone agreement is another. We published that at the time. Everybody was congratulating, and I know that the bank has participated quite heavily to the success of this new trade agreement. But the fact is that all the past trade agreements have not increased trade. So again, it's like talking about the painting on a car before the car is built. If you don't have roads or you don't have energy to support manufacturing development or railway, or everything is delayed, or you have changing on top of that, tax. It addresses in theory the tax issue here, but it's only one element of a much bigger problem to stimulate trade. It goes in the right direction, but I don't think just because you sign an agreement that it will solve all the issues that I mentioned before. And probably it will be more the countries that are a bit more advanced that will benefit the most, because they have a manufacturing sector like South Africa or Egypt that will be able to sell their production, avoiding some of the taxes. But some other countries will need to really accelerate on the development of light manufacturing, at least to really benefit from that trade agreement in particular. The previous question on the PEG, it's very important. I think one of the reasons Côte d'Ivoire was able to access the market and Benin or Cameroon this year is because of the PEG. And after swap, the cost for Benin and Côte d'Ivoire was quite good. I think the market understands, especially now that you had countries that were not supposed to have defaulted, such as Ghana. Look at the issuance of Kenya, for example, because there was so much uncertainty for so long. Ultimately, they issued at more than 10%, but it was detrimental for the whole private sector. Banks had difficulty to fund themselves because reserves were pressured. The currency devalued. So all the private companies, SMEs, were suffering from that uncertainty. Ultimately, Kenya was able to secure some of the funds, but did not follow through on the reform that was supposed to happen with the support of the Bretton Woods institution. So it's just to illustrate that probably in the CEMAC and the WAMU, the protection it provides is not fully understood. Us at Moody's, we always say that we consider it as credit positive for the country, because it protects against large shocks. For example, the global inflation shock of 2008 between food and energy. Most of the East African countries had to devalue their currency. A country like Senegal has the 20% current account deficit because of that, but the population continued to enjoy the CFA. The inflation was really tamed, and then the shock was absorbed because of the access to the pool of reserves. What about Mali, Niger, and Burkina that have a current, I would say, relatively high political risk with military government and are in political transition? Without the CFA, probably the currency would have collapsed, and capital will have flown out of these countries. It's the same for Republic Centrafricaine in the CEMAC. So it protects from external shock, but also it protects against what I mentioned before, the volatility of the exchange rate that could affect the debt burden and the payment of interest. Here, the risk is a euro-dollar risk mostly. And when you see, for example, what happened in Nigeria, where the currency fell from 400 to 1,600 naira to the dollar, everything that is owned in our currency has been multiplied by 3. So that kind of shock is rather limited in this region. So for all the economic agent of the CFA zone, they benefit from this protection, but at the same time, there are rules to respect, like the repatriation of some of the export earnings, the necessity to provide some documents when someone wants to access the reserves, and also, of course, any investment that goes through the central is safe in a sense that in theory, it could access the reserves when there are payments to be made.
Thank you very much. Nous avons une question dans la salle de la part de Ba Mohamedou.
Bien sûr.
Ouais, merci Francis. Merci Aurélien pour cet excellent exposé qui donne effectivement une perspective globale sur la réalité des risques et la perception des risques en Afrique. J'insiste sur ces deux mots, hein, la réalité et la perception. On sait tous que l'aspect macro global à l'échelle du pays est important, effectivement. C'est l'environnement dans lequel opèrent les différents acteurs, à savoir les États, conversation aujourd'hui, et puis les entreprises en dessous des banques locales. Donc, in fine, pour assesser le risque lié à ces acteurs, on est obligé de prendre en compte l'environnement. Mais je voudrais plutôt faire un focus sur les banques africaines, les banques locales, et parler peut-être le risque associé au trade finance, au financement du commerce, qui, on sait tous, est un peu différent des risques classiques qu'on peut observer à l'échelle un peu plus bas au niveau des PME et tout ça. Dans leur relation avec les banques confirmatrices, ce qui est vraiment souvent mis en avant, c'est l'aspect risque macro, souverain, pour justement déterminer à quel taux les banques locales africaines doivent emprunter, quel est le niveau des lignes de confirmation qu'on doit leur attribuer, tout un tas de choses. Alors que quand on regarde le secteur bancaire de façon générale, on peut dire quand même qu'il y a eu beaucoup d'efforts qui ont été faits dans l'assainissement, en tout cas dans certains pays, et que les défauts de paiement, les risques liés aux défauts sont très limités à l'échelle des banques, encore une fois. Il y en a quelques-unes qui ont eu des difficultés, mais elles sont rares. Je voulais juste savoir votre peut-être œil, votre perception en tant qu'expert sur ces dimensions. Vraiment, peut-être la nécessité d'aller encore un peu plus, je veux dire, à l'intérieur de l'analyse. Ouais, je voulais juste savoir votre avis sur cet aspect.
Merci. Je vais répondre en français puisque la question a été posée en français. Tous ces éléments sont très justes. Je pense que lorsqu'un pays n'est pas noté, il y a je parle de la notation de crédit, hein, par exemple, il y aura de la part des partenaires à l'extérieur un premium de transparence qui sera ajouté à la prime de la transaction. Maintenant, lorsqu'un pays est noté, dans un premier temps, même si les banques ne sont pas notées, le partenaire va utiliser, le financier va utiliser la notation du pays comme un proxy pour estimer la solidité de crédit des banques, puisque, comme vous le savez, si une banque est en difficulté, si c'est de la liquidité, elle peut être aidée par la Banque centrale. Si c'est un problème de solvabilité, c'est une recapitalisation. Mais in fine, si c'est un problème systémique, c'est le ministère des Finances qui va devoir soutenir la Banque centrale. Donc, il y a cet élément de corrélation. Les banques sont généralement spécifiques et compte tenu de leur importance dans un système économique, elles ont ce côté de soutien potentiel qui peut arriver de la part des autorités. Ceci étant dit, lorsqu'on regarde, prenons par exemple la zone ouest africaine de l'UMOA, on a le retrait de certaines banques internationales de la région. Donc, comment interpréter ça? Alors, dans la présentation de M. Atou, je pense qu'il a mentionné les risques liés à la gestion des risques pour le financement de la lutte contre le financement du terrorisme et du blanchiment d'argent, etc. Tout ça, c'est vrai. Mais quelle est la conséquence pour le continent? La conséquence, c'est qu'il y a une opportunité pour des groupes régionaux de prendre position très significative dans le système financier africain. Mais est-ce que ça pose aussi des risques? Est-ce que la gestion du risque va être aussi bonne? Est-ce que la profondeur des capacités de financement va être meilleure ou moins bonne? est-ce que la capacité de gérer les risques aussi va être améliorée? Donc, ces questions vont être démontrées au cours du temps. Maintenant, lorsque une banque, par exemple dans n'importe quel pays, fait son financement, en théorie, elle doit connaître l'emprunteur, avoir accès aux comptes qui sont certifiés, avoir de l'information sur, etc. Il y a un nombre d'informations importantes qui souvent n'existent pas. Et ce que l'on voit la plupart du temps, c'est pratiquement dans tous les pays, les banques financent le gouvernement. Elles financent le gouvernement, elles font un peu de crédit au secteur privé, mais les plus gros acteurs qui sont connus, qui ont justement ces informations, et elles se font la guerre, ou enfin la guerre, elles font de la compétition, c'est sur les meilleurs noms, mais le reste du secteur privé qui a besoin de financement parce qu'il n'a pas tous ces éléments d'information et parce que l'État a tellement besoin de financement que la banque n'a même pas assez de liquidité, elle dépend de la liquidité banque centrale dans plusieurs pays pour assurer le financement du déficit. Pour une banque, c'est vu comme un investissement sans risque parce qu'elle peut replacer les obligations d'État à la banque centrale, ils sont éligibles au refinancement et surtout, elle emprunte à la banque centrale à, je ne sais pas, 4, mettons, et elle prête aux États à 7 ou 8 ou 9 dans certains cas. Donc, et n'importe quel agent économique qui serait dans cette situation, par rapport à aller chercher toutes les informations pour prêter à un secteur privé qui est vu comme risqué, ferait la décision de prêter là où il y a une apparence de moindre risque. Donc, pour essayer de répondre clairement à votre question, je pense que lorsque effectivement la situation du souverain s'améliorera et qu'il ne, comme on dit, n'évincera pas le secteur privé, il y aura plus de financement disponible pour le secteur privé et aussi de la part de l'extérieur, parce que l'extérieur se dira l'État réduit sa dette, il consolide son budget, il y aura moins de risques d'instabilité macroéconomique et en plus, les projets pour des investissements directs, ça veut dire moins de taxes dans le futur et encore une fois, la stabilité macroéconomique et donc moins de volatilité dans la décision de l'investissement. Voilà ce que je peux dire pour répondre à votre question.
Merci, merci. Très bonne réponse. On a aussi une question dans le chat. C'est une question à 3 volets. Par quels moyens peut-on atténuer les risques d'insécurité dans les pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest? Le deuxième volet de cette question, c'est quel conseil donnerez-vous aux États qui ont bénéficié des eurobonds afin d'éviter les problèmes de paiement à l'échéance?
Alors, je commence par cette deuxième question. En tant qu'agence de notation, on ne peut pas donner de conseils. On ne peut pas être jugé parti. Donc, on parle des faiblesses et des forces d'un investisseur, d'un émetteur. Et il n'y a en aucun cas notre rôle de dire vous devez faire ça. Maintenant, parmi certains pays, il y a des pays qui ont emprunté sur les marchés financiers et qui ont bien géré le profil de dette. Donc, je mentionnerai la Côte d'Ivoire. La Côte d'Ivoire a passé son temps à prépayer certaines obligations pour pousser dans le temps les maturités. Aujourd'hui, la Côte d'Ivoire n'a aucune maturité qui arrive à échéance de manière significative avant 2032. Donc, durant la période là où les marchés étaient plus difficiles d'accès, c'est pas un pays qui a souffert trop du fait que les marchés, les taux d'intérêt étaient devenus beaucoup plus élevés parce qu'il avait réussi à trouver des financements ici et là avec des partenaires, etc. D'autres pays qui n'avaient pas pensé suffisamment au problème de refinancement si le marché est fermé, l'accès est fermé, sont retrouvés avec des difficultés, et ces difficultés que j'ai mentionnées par exemple au Kenya cette année, alors que l'émission arrivait avec un remboursement de 2 milliards qui arrivait, mais ils ont réussi à trouver des solutions. Mais donc, cette gestion proactive de la dette est très importante. Et il y a des pays qui l'ont très bien fait, le Bénin est un autre exemple, et il y a d'autres pays qui ont moins bien réussi parce qu'ils ont eu des chocs, parce que certaines de leurs initiatives n'ont pas fonctionné, comme par exemple la Zambie ou le Ghana. Il y avait une autre question, je crois, et je suis un peu perdu. Francis, si tu peux me...
Oui, là, il y avait la première question était par quels moyens peut-on atténuer les risques d'insécurité dans les pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest? C'est un peu très générique la question, mais bon.
It's in English or in French? It's en français? Bon, je réponds en français. Donc, par exemple, je suis le lead d'analyse sur le Mali. J'ai un collègue qui est lead d'analyse sur le Niger. On a suivi le développement de la crise politique au Sahel depuis longtemps. J'ai été longtemps le lead d'analyse sur le Nigeria. C'est le même problème dans les provinces du nord-est du Nigeria. Ça affectait aussi des pays comme le nord du Cameroun, le Tchad, etc. Donc, le problème de la situation au Sahel n'est pas limité juste aux 3 pays où il y a eu des coups d'État avec maintenant des gouvernements militaires, mais c'est plus général sur toute la zone du Sahel. On peut pas donner de conseils, encore une fois, mais ce qui est clair, c'est que ces problèmes sont de longue durée. C'est pas des problèmes qui vont être réglés facilement. Et c'est, je dirais, exacerbé par le fait que aujourd'hui, il y a des zones de non-droit, avec également une violence qui entraîne de la violence et qui fait que compte tenu aussi des niveaux de vie, des revenus des populations et de la pauvreté, la situation est extrêmement difficile à atténuer. Donc, ça va prendre du temps. Il va y avoir un besoin de dialogue, j'imagine, un besoin de soutien aussi extérieur, probablement à un moment donné pour ces pays, pour éviter qu'ils ne sombrent, en fait. Du fait de cette violence et de cette insécurité. Mais ça va prendre du temps.
Non, merci beaucoup. Je pense qu'on a encore 5 minutes. Je vais poser aussi une question toujours du chat de la part de Adèle. Qu'en est-il des risques liés aux réglementations régionales et leur harmonisation au niveau, par exemple, de la CEDEAO? Par exemple, la question du tarif extérieur commun de la CEDEAO et la bande tarifaire pour les riz comme produit de base est source de risques importants.
Encore une fois, I switch. The ECOWAS decision of regulation is an important element for integration, but this is the implementation that is, I would say, that could be, seen or perceived as less easy than when it's decided. The tariff on the ECOWAS that is shared among all the sovereign works because the country, or at least the institution, is able to raise some revenues. But at the same time, as the participant mentioned, for example, the rice, we know that every country has played its own strategy to boost and to use, for example, the positioning to boost its trade and the ability to make financial gains. I'm not going to give names, but when a country decided to raise tariff on rice imports to protect its heavy investment in development of the sector, others started to lower their custom tariff to attract the exporters, so that they can channel then back the rice to the country that at the tariff. So there was I would say, an uncooperative, position, which undermines a bit the overall, goal. At the same time, countries are very different in the regions. They are not all the same, and therefore it's very difficult to take decisions that will work for everybody. And the rift that we've seen today, this year, with the RS countries asking to leave the ECOWAS, signal exactly that some country thinks that, you know, we might be better if we're outside, not the WAMU, because the WAMU is too important, but the ECOWAS, which is more political union, that enhance rules or, you know, reglementation.
Thank you very much. I think we still have room for one last question. So the question is about, you know, what is your take on the loan accumulations by African countries? Is this considered sustainable over a long time? How will you suggest this be handled going forward?
Again, we cannot just suggest anything. I mean, a country is a sovereign institution, and it can do as it sees fit for itself. But and I think I was in the past for a long time the lead analyst on the African Development Bank, and when the country started to ramp up borrowing, being international or even commercial, all the MDBs were worried because they had just done the MDRI initiative, and what we see today, they predicted it 15 years ago. They said, look, we are here to help you as a multilateral development institution to provide concessional loans, and to help to make sure that the funds will be used in the right way, and you are not going to get, you know, I would say, getting into all sorts of issues. But the issuer, the sovereigns, they said it's too long. There are conditions. It's tranche. The disbursement is tranche by tranche, and so the Eurobond and the loans that because they had restored their balance sheet was more easy to access and gives them more freedom. And so it's a fact. The charts that I showed the deterioration of the balance sheet and the return above 60% of GDP in many countries on the continent, and even in the two zones. And now the debt has been borrowed; it has to be repaid. That's the issue. In 2000, what I was saying is that most of the debt was in few MDBs, and in the G20, it was more the G7, and they decided to forgive the debt on some reforms. Today, look at Zambia. It took 4 years or plus to get a credit agreement to restructure the debt. It's extremely painful for the economy. It was extremely uncooperative. There has been some reforms piloted by the IMF to try to accelerate the restructuring when a country is really on the brink of default, to make it easier. But not many countries have joined the common framework. The ones that have joined, which is the framework to organize the default, you know, you have Zambia, Chad did it, Ethiopia and Ghana. Ethiopia and Ghana are still not done, except Ghana is almost solved. It seems is going to make an announcement in not distant future. But this process is very complex because of the diversification of the lenders, and therefore you have banks, you have bondholders, you have bilateral partners. It's not just the G7. You have countries that don't cancel debt among the lenders and so on. So it is a key question for the future when a country defaults because of insolvency. It's high on the G20 and the authorities.
Non, thank you. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Aurélien. Je vous repasse juste la parole pour 1 minute de mot de fin et puis on va clôturer. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. I think it is a very important topic, the access and the risk and challenges for accessing funding on the continent. as Moody's, we think that transparency is key. A rating is an opinion on the credit quality. There have been, countries or corporate that have really managed to benefit, from this initiative. And we really think that you never lose at being transparent because you set the stage and you continue to deal with the issues as they are explained or viewed by third parties, including, not just the credit rating, but anything that can demonstrate or build a track record of progress in any element. And I think and I would like that to be very clear. The funding problem is not a problem because of the money. The money exists. Projects that are well calibrated, well edged, they are funded. In Africa, for example, the infrastructure, the submarine cable, the telecom, the towers, because it's easy, well crafted, it was funded by private sector very easily. The issue is for the other sector where there is a lot of interference and vulnerability to elements, again, that are difficult to manage or to protect against.
Thank you very much. I cannot add more to that closing remark, and just taking this opportunity to thank all the participants in this session and for, the excellent question raised. And thank you very much, Aurélien.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup. Nous aurons maintenant une présentation par M. Ba Mohamedou de la division du financement du commerce de la Banque africaine de développement. Cette présentation portera beaucoup plus sur les produits de la Banque africaine de développement sur le financement du commerce. Donc, j'aimerais passer la parole à Mamadou pour une brève présentation de 10 minutes. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Francis. Merci encore une fois, Aurélien, pour cette présentation très instructive. Effectivement, j'ai 10 minutes entre collègues banquiers. Normalement, on devrait avoir plus de temps pour échanger, pour justement vous entretenir de ce qu'on fait au niveau de la BAD pour soutenir les banques locales et pour travailler avec les banques internationales au fin justement de permettre de faciliter cette relation qui est très importante en matière de financement du commerce. Donc, l'objectif de cette présentation va porter sur essentiellement 3 points. Vous expliquer de façon succincte, mais on aura l'occasion effectivement avec le contact email qu'on va vous laisser de peut-être approfondir les discussions sur les types d'instruments financés, non financés, les instruments de garantie que la BAD propose justement pour soutenir les banques locales, pour les aider justement à accéder à davantage de lignes de confirmation. Pour certaines, en fait, les aider à accéder à des ressources en devises qui sont essentielles pour le financement du commerce. Et pour d'autres aussi, à pouvoir bénéficier de temps à autre des différentes initiatives qu'on met en place à travers ce qu'on appelle le capacity building. Je pense que cette session aujourd'hui, ce workshop sur ce trade finance, participe aussi de cet effort. Et on fait aussi d'autres choses dans le domaine de la certification. On a eu à travailler avec des institutions internationales comme ICC. On en a fait bénéficier à des banques locales. Je pense qu'on va vous entretenir de tout ça. Le deuxième objectif, c'est justement, je pense que tout un chacun va se poser la question, qu'est-ce que la BAD fait dans le financement du commerce? Comment ceci est lié à son mandat principal, comme vous le savez, qui consiste effectivement à soutenir nos États, à financer des grands projets dans le domaine des infrastructures, dans le domaine de l'éducation, dans le domaine de l'énergie, de l'agriculture et bien d'autres domaines pour justement aider nos États à remonter, à faire face à ces contraintes au niveau macro auquel Aurélien faisait justement allusion, et comment justement le travail qu'on fait dans le financement du commerce s'inscrit aussi dans les initiatives de soutien au secteur privé qui constituent un pôle important au niveau des activités de la BAD. Elle est organisée en plusieurs complexes, de nombreux complexes justement travaillent avec les États, le souverain. Et il y a un complexe secteur privé qui travaille avec les acteurs du secteur privé, les grandes entreprises locales, l'ensemble des institutions qui tournent autour du secteur privé, mais qui travaillent beaucoup avec les institutions financières locales, les banques. Donc, si vous pouvez envoyer la deuxième slide. Donc, la présentation va tourner autour de justement ces trois topics, la BAD et le financement du commerce, les instruments de financement du commerce que la BAD propose, quelques exemples parmi tant d'autres. On en a fait pas mal d'initiatives, pas mal de partenariats, mais on a voulu peut-être illustrer ça avec quelques exemples pour juste vous donner une idée sur quelle zone on travaille, qu'est-ce qu'on propose concrètement. Si je peux avoir la prochaine slide. Donc, comme je le disais tantôt, la BAD, elle est organisée en plusieurs complexes. C'est vraiment des grands complexes et dans chaque complexe, on a plusieurs directions. Et au sein de ces directions, on a encore des divisions. Nous, aujourd'hui, en face de vous, c'est la division du financement du commerce, logée dans le département du développement du secteur financier, qui lui-même est logé dans le complexe de secteur privé et infrastructure. Donc, le développement du secteur financier lui-même en trois pôles, avec un pôle intermédiation et inclusion financière. J'ai envie de dire c'est la division traditionnelle la plus ancienne qui travaille avec les banques locales comme les vôtres, justement, pour proposer des solutions de financement, on va dire souvent à long terme. On parle des prêts sur 5 ans, 7 ans, 10 ans, voire plus parfois. On parle aussi de l'ensemble des initiatives qui peuvent toucher aux sociétés dans le domaine de l'affacturage. Dans le fintech, on parle aussi des investissements que la banque fait pour soutenir les fonds d'investissement qui investissent dans des secteurs stratégiques en Afrique, en ligne avec ce que vous avez sûrement entendu parler, les high five, les secteurs stratégiques ciblés par la BAD. On parle aussi de l'ensemble des initiatives justement à l'endroit des institutions financières non bancaires, tout ce qui touche à la digitalisation, qui touche à l'inclusion financière. Donc ça, c'est le pôle inclusion et intermédiation financière. Il y a un second pôle qui est important, c'est tout le travail que la banque fait au niveau du développement des marchés de capitaux. On en a parlé, c'est un levier très important pour accéder au financement. Je pense qu'avec le développement des marchés capitaux régionaux au sein de l'espace IMOA, au sein de plusieurs pays aujourd'hui, la banque travaille énormément avec les gouvernements, avec les bourses régionales, avec des compagnies hypothécaires, des émetteurs de bons et tout un tas d'acteurs qui gravitent autour justement des marchés de capitaux pour renforcer ce pilier en tout cas de financement. Elle fait aussi énormément de projets avec les États aujourd'hui, justement pour leur accorder des garanties qui leur permettent d'aller sur les marchés internationaux avec une garantie de la BAD qui permet justement de bonifier le taux auquel ils accèdent au prêt. C'est une division assez importante. La troisième, celle qui fait l'objet aujourd'hui de cette présentation et celle à laquelle j'appartiens, la division du financement du commerce, comme je le disais tantôt, qui travaille avec justement les banques locales comme les vôtres, les banques internationales, justement dans l'objectif de faciliter cette relation entre banques locales et banques internationales. On travaille directement avec les banques locales à travers des prêts qu'on accorde sur des durées, on va dire, de 3 à 4 ans, spécifiquement dédiés au financement des opérations dans le domaine de l'import et de l'export, spécifiquement trade finance. Un autre point important qui, lui, concerne l'ensemble des divisions, c'est la partie, justement, fonds fiduciaires pour le développement des marchés capitaux, comme je disais. L'initiative Making Finance Work for Africa, nos partenaires, justement, pour l'organisation de ces séminaires, et tous les programmes d'assistance technique, d'études thématiques qu'on fait avec les départements économiques et recherche de la BAD sur les questions liées au financement du commerce. Je pense que vous avez souvent entendu ces rapports de la BAD périodiques sur des périodes de 3-4 années qui font des enquêtes poussées, exhaustives sur les contraintes d'accès au financement du commerce, quels sont les enjeux, les challenges et puis qu'est-ce qu'il convient de faire pour peut-être remédier à tout ça. Et comme je l'avais dit aussi au début de la présentation, toutes les initiatives liées justement au renforcement des capacités, les différents séminaires et workshops qu'on organise et tout le travail qu'on fait aussi avec des organisations comme ITFA. Je remercie notre collègue Ted qui est avec nous aujourd'hui, qui représente le comité régional de ITFA, qui travaille beaucoup sur les questions liées aux problématiques d'accès de financement aux PME, PMI, problématiques d'accès de financement, accès au financement des banques locales et puis qui essaie de représenter la voix de l'Afrique, pardon, au sein des instances internationales, l'ICC, la Chambre de commerce qui justement internationale qui est en charge des questions liées au trade. Donc là-bas, travaille beaucoup avec toutes ces organisations pour essayer de faire entendre la voix de l'Afrique et puis pour essayer de faire avancer aussi certaines problématiques, certains sujets que nous savons tous très prégnants chez nous. La prochaine slide, please. Donc, comme je le disais tantôt, la division de financement du commerce, le programme soutient activement les institutions financières africaines et leur permet de faire face aux contraintes liées au financement et du commerce international. Concrètement, ça veut dire quoi? Ça veut dire qu'aujourd'hui, on travaille quasiment avec 200 banques en Afrique, si je puis dire, 170 à 200, avec lesquelles on a soit des partenaires directs, c'est-à-dire pour lesquels on a accordé une ligne de financement, ou pour lesquels on soutient justement, on garantit les lettres de crédit que confirment les banques internationales pour votre bénéfice. À travers justement ces 4 instruments que je vais développer, donc les lignes de crédit de financement du commerce, c'est des facilités consolidées financées en devises euros qu'on met à la disposition des banques après tout un processus de due diligence, bien évidemment, pour s'assurer de l'éligibilité des banques. Je pense que aujourd'hui, on n'aura pas le temps d'aller sur les critères d'éligibilité de façon détaillée et j'imagine que c'est ce qui intéresse le banquier de savoir est-ce qu'il y a droit. On va dire que toutes les banques africaines qui sont actives dans le financement du commerce sont éligibles justement à ces lignes de financement. Après, reste qu'on va justement les assesser, on va les analyser, les étudier sur 2 aspects. Le premier aspect que tout banquier ferait, ce serait de s'assurer de la viabilité commerciale de l'institution, sa capacité justement à lever le financement, à l'utiliser conformément à la convention qui sera signée, mais surtout sa capacité à pouvoir justement rembourser convenablement à la ligne, ce qui est essentiel. Un autre aspect qui est important pour une banque de développement comme la BAD, tout en sachant que l'objectif premier de la BAD, en tout cas pour entrer dans cette activité, n'est pas vraiment commercial. Elle est plus d'accompagner les banques et elle est plus aussi de pouvoir aider ces banques à toucher au secteur stratégique, à financer les acteurs clés justement de ces secteurs, les PME et les entreprises locales. Donc, on analyse toujours ce qu'on appelle chez nous l'additionnalité et l'impact de développement de la transaction, qui sont des éléments essentiels, aussi importants que la dimension crédit, sinon peut-être plus importantes pour certains. C'est-à-dire que si on met à disposition des fonds, on veut pouvoir mesurer derrière l'impact que ces financements ont eu à renforcer justement les activités économiques des bénéficiaires, à pouvoir mesurer si possible, tout aussi challenging et difficile, l'impact que ça a eu en termes de création d'emplois, en termes de, voilà, de génération de revenus et tout ce qui peut arriver derrière comme impact. Donc ça, c'est les lignes de financement du commerce d'une durée, encore une fois, de 3 à 4 ans. Les montants peuvent être importants. Ce qui est important chez nous, c'est encore une fois la capacité d'absorption de l'institution, le niveau des fonds propres. On regarde la taille du bilan, on regarde aussi le portefeuille de projet, si je puis dire, derrière. C'est ça qui détermine le montant. Suivant la taille des banques, ça peut aller de 5, 10 à 100, 200, voire même parfois 300 millions, voire plus. Mais tout en sachant que le montant le plus habituel, c'est entre, on va dire, 10 millions et 100 millions de dollars ou euros, suivant la devise de financement. Donc ça, c'est le premier instrument. Évidemment, il y a d'autres aspects liés à la tarification et tout ça, tout en sachant que nous, quand on vient dans ce secteur, quand on essaie de soutenir une banque, ce qui est important pour nous, c'est de lui apporter le soutien nécessaire, de pouvoir aussi lui proposer une tarification qui est en ligne avec son profil de risque et en ligne avec ce que propose le marché. L'objectif étant de ne pas créer une forme de distorsion de concurrence sur le marché, parce qu'on n'a pas la capacité à nous tout seuls de changer la dynamique du marché. Donc, l'intelligence veut que tu t'alignes sur la dynamique du marché, mais laisser peut-être les acteurs eux-mêmes entreprendre les réformes, les initiatives nécessaires à améliorer leur profil crédit. Néanmoins, ce qu'on fait, c'est que si on sait que le profil crédit est affecté par des soucis liés à des capacités internes, on essaie toujours de proposer une forme d'assistance technique pour aider à remédier à ces contraintes d'ordre interne, de sorte à pouvoir relever un peu le profil crédit du client. Le deuxième instrument, c'est ce qu'on appelle typiquement le soft commodity financing, la facilité de financement des matières premières agricoles. C'est mis en deuxième dans cette présentation, mais je vais y revenir après avoir abordé les instruments de garantie qui me semblent aussi tout aussi importants. La raison étant que pour cet instrument en particulier, la facilité de financement des matières premières agricoles, vous remarquerez que depuis le début, j'ai toujours parlé de nos partenariats avec les banques locales et les banques internationales. Donc, au niveau du financement du commerce, on finance les banques locales. On prend le risque sur les banques locales et qui, elles, à leur tour, prêtent à leurs clients, PME, PMI et entreprises locales. Évidemment, on se demandera toujours pourquoi nous, on n'irait pas prêter directement aux PME, PMI, ce qui est assez difficile, assez challenging pour les raisons qu'Aurélien a évoquées tout à l'heure. L'accès justement à ces entités, l'accès aux données l'accès aux données de financement de ces PME. Donc, ah ouais, d'accord, OK. Et on me dit que le temps, le temps est bientôt fini. Donc, je vais plutôt parler des instruments de garantie avant de revenir à cet instrument de soft community financing. Les instruments de garantie, en réalité, on a deux types d'instruments. Le premier, c'est ce qu'on appelle les accords de partage des risques. On travaille avec les banques internationales, celles qui financent aujourd'hui, qui confirment vos lettres de crédit. On a des partenaires avec pas mal de banques internationales, de banques régionales, où en gros, on partage le risque qu'ils prennent sur les banques locales. On les incite, on leur donne plus de capacité à mettre davantage de lignes de confirmation à votre disposition pour justement qu'ils puissent davantage soutenir ces banques. Et un instrument tout aussi important qu'on a lancé récemment, c'est la garantie de transaction qui, elle, le partenariat est direct avec la banque locale, c'est-à-dire qu'on a la possibilité de vous proposer une garantie qui viendra vous couvrir dans le cadre de vos, comment dire, de vos lettres de crédit ou de vos lignes de financement mises à disposition par les banques internationales. Concrètement, quand vous avez une contrainte justement à obtenir une ligne de confirmation, soit disant que voilà, le profil crédit n'est pas ce qu'il faut, ou bien la ligne mise à votre disposition n'est pas suffisante pour couvrir les besoins, vous avez la possibilité de solliciter la BAD pour qu'on émette une garantie de sorte à donner du confort à la banque internationale pour qu'elle puisse confirmer votre lettre de crédit, sans pour autant peut-être qu'elle demande en contrepartie un dépôt de cash collatéral au niveau de la ligne, ou en tout cas, ça permet de réduire ce dépôt, ça permet en tout cas de faciliter la transaction. On a pas mal de banques justement qui sont membres de ce programme. L'objectif, c'est aujourd'hui de vous entretenir par rapport à ça et de voir dans quelle mesure on pourrait rentrer en contact avec vous pour que nos collègues vous aident à adhérer à ce programme. Pour revenir aux facilités de financement des matières premières agricoles, je disais tantôt, c'est le seul instrument pour lequel on travaille avec ce qu'on appelle le commodity aggregator, c'est-à-dire les grandes entreprises ou les entreprises locales engagées dans le financement des matières premières agricoles, coton, cacao, tous les produits soft. Donc, on a la possibilité de mettre en place des sortes de lignes corporate pour le bénéfice de ces institutions. Donc, voilà schématiquement les 4 instruments qu'on propose, 2 instruments financiers, 2 instruments de garantie à l'endroit des banques locales. Encore une fois, on aura l'occasion peut-être d'échanger plus en détail sur ces instruments. La prochaine slide, please. Donc, je disais tantôt, aujourd'hui, on a un portefeuille direct actif peut-être d'une cinquantaine de partenaires. On a un portefeuille indirect, si je puis dire, de plus de 177 banques, voire plus. Là, on a donné l'exemple, par exemple, d'EcoBank, une banque régionale avec laquelle on travaille. On a eu avec eux des facilités financières et des accords de partage de risques. Une banque locale, NCA Bank, on aurait pu en citer d'autres avec lesquels on travaille un peu partout, au Maroc, en Afrique centrale, en Afrique de l'Ouest, en Afrique australe, un peu partout. Et puis Attijari Wafa Bank, qui est aussi une banque régionale de premier plan. Et on a mis l'exemple d'Access Bank RDC Congo, pour laquelle on a mis en place récemment une ligne de garantie. Et on travaille encore une fois avec toutes les banques. On a cité que celle-là, mais il y en a d'autres. Je suis sûr qu'il y a des participants aujourd'hui avec qui on a déjà travaillé. Donc, l'objectif, c'est de vous inciter, de venir de l'avant, contacter les collègues avec l'adresse mail. Je peux avoir la prochaine slide, please. L'adresse mail sur cette slide. Et puis aussi sur le site de la BAD avec tout ce que j'ai expliqué ici autour du programme, encore plus de détails sur l'ensemble des instruments, les conditions d'éligibilité et tout et tout. L'objectif étant progressivement de voir en tout cas toutes les banques locales africaines adhérer au programme. C'est un programme assez flexible, il n'y a pas de coût à proprement parler. Le processus de due diligence, il peut être long, on va dire 4 à 6 mois, voire un peu plus. Mais une fois que l'adhésion est faite, ça permet justement, à chaque fois que vous aurez une opération pour laquelle, si vous avez une ligne de confirmation qui couvre l'opération, tant mieux. Si par contre, vous devez mettre en contrepartie un dépôt de cash ou à la limite, si vous avez besoin d'une garantie, on est à mesure peut-être d'apporter cette garantie. Tout en sachant encore une fois que c'est un accord tripartite entre la banque locale, la BAD et puis la banque internationale qui vous soutient pour justement faciliter le partenariat. Je vais peut-être arrêter là. Il y a beaucoup de choses à dire, mais le temps qui nous a été accordé, je pense, s'achève, quoi. Et puis, on sera ravis de prendre des questions. Je ne sais pas si on aura le temps d'y répondre. C'est qu'entre banquiers, dès qu'on parle de financement, il y a beaucoup de questions. Mais on se fera le plaisir de répondre à vos questions quand on sera en contact direct avec vous. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Mohamedou. Je propose que s'il y a des questions, vous les posez sur le chat et Mamadou aura vraiment le plaisir de les répondre. Je demande aussi à Mamadou si possible de partager sur le chat comment entrer en contact avec la banque. C'est sur le slide, mais si vous pouvez aussi juste mettre sur le chat, ça sera facilement accessible. Donc, merci beaucoup. Je pense avec ces deux interventions, nous clôturons la première phase. Nous prenons une petite pause de 10 minutes. OK, il y a une question, mais est-ce qu'on peut la prendre en fonction du temps?
Ouais.
OK, Mohamedou.
Ouais, on a une question sur le chat et puis on va essayer d'y répondre. Quel est exactement le type de garantie donnée par la BAD aux banques internationales pour le compte des entreprises ou banques locales? La deuxième partie de la question, c'est quelles sont exactement ces garanties? Est-ce un engagement par signataire qui s'interprète comme une garantie ou est-ce des garanties connues ordinairement demandées par le domaine bancaire? Alors, on émet des garanties au profit des banques internationales pour couvrir le risque sur les banques locales, encore une fois. Notre intervention s'arrête aux banques locales. Donc, notre garantie ne couvre pas le risque derrière pour l'entreprise ou la PME. En ce qui concerne, évidemment, les garanties de financement du commerce. C'est les garanties types émises à travers, les messages SWIFT et tout, et qui ont pour vocation justement de permettre à la Banque internationale de pouvoir substituer le risque banque locale par le risque BAD, ce qui a toute son importance en termes de bonification de la transaction, du point de vue, on va dire, de sa tarification et du point de vue aussi des contraintes de capital que ça peut représenter pour eux. En gros, étant une institution en réalité triple A, vous imaginez qu'elle aura plus intérêt à avoir un risque porté par la BAD dans son bilan que porté sur une autre entité. Et ça lui permettra de faire davantage. Donc, la garantie, en tout cas, pour le financement du commerce, s'arrête à ce niveau. Encore une fois, comme je l'avais dit, elle peut avoir elle peut être de deux façons, à travers les accords de partage de risque, mais ça, c'est un peu confidentiel, silent à l'endroit de la banque locale. Vous n'êtes pas au courant. C'est la banque internationale qui sait qu'il est couvert et que ça reste entre nous. Et il y a la garantie directe, comme je l'avais dit, celle-là, elle est connue, elle est tripartite et elle est émise avec votre accord, votre consentement pour justement couvrir une transaction. Après, il y avait peut-être un autre volet sur la question. Désolé, hein, je vais juste... C'est parti, non? Hein? Ou c'est moi qui l'ai... Ouais, non. Bon, je crois que... Non, j'ai perdu le... Non, je sais pas. Elle est partie, je sais plus. Il y avait un autre volet sur la question, mais bon, on aura l'occasion peut-être d'y répondre ouais, en d'autres temps.
OK. Non, merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. On va donc prendre une pause de 10 minutes. Il est actuellement 10h40, donc on retourne à 10h50. Merci beaucoup.
Ouais, peut-être juste pour insister, demander aux collègues de rester en ligne. Il y a deux sessions qui sont essentielles et importantes pour ceux qui sont actifs dans le financement du commerce. C'est la digitalisation. Vous entendez partout en parler, l'intelligence artificielle qui va devenir quelque chose de très important dans ce domaine. Donc, on a d'éminents speakers, Ted et notre collègue, qui vont faire une présentation, je pense, qui vaut le coup de suivre. Et puis derrière, une thématique aussi essentielle, la compliance KYC, les impacts que ça peut représenter pour vous. Je pense que ça vaut le coup vraiment d'assister à ces deux séances. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, on retourne dans 10 minutes. Merci. Merci.
Which is looking at how digitalization is transforming trade finance. To introduce myself again, I am Ted George, and I work for the Secretariat of the Africa Regional Committee of ITFA, the International Trade and Forfaiting Association. And a lot of the work I do is also with Mo, who we just saw presenting. He also sits on the ARC. So what we would like to do with the second session is look at digitalization. The digital transformation of the entire global economy has been something remarkable to behold over recent years, but trade finance has been relatively slow to adopt. There have been some advances when it comes to digital documentation, but there are a lot of barriers out there. And there has long been an assumption that if we want to digitalize something like trade finance in Africa, it's simply too expensive or too difficult to do. But the reality is, of course, that actually a lot of the digital tools that are out there are, in fact, very usable in countries in West and Central Africa. And in this session today, we're going to look at the potential for what digitalization of trade can present, but also we're going to look at some of the specific examples of different companies and innovators out there who can really help bring digital to trade finance and ultimately automate certain processes and also actually reduce your workload, increase efficiency, and hopefully get the funding flowing. So before we start, maybe if we could have another poll, I'd like to ask a poll about where we think the benefits come from trade finance. So if you could put up the poll on the benefits of digitalization in trade finance, please. So do you want to put up the poll? I'll be sharing my own slides. Thank you. Are we able to have the poll?
Just confirm, please, is it through digitalization?
Yes, it's the one on digitalization, bringing the benefit for trade finance.
Okay, let me launch what I have here.
Thank you.
Hope you can see. Is that one? Is it okay?
Yes, it's that one. Thank you. So the question is, this is to everyone, and we will discuss this in the session. In your opinion, where can digitalization bring the most benefit for trade finance in West and Central Africa? Is it KYC and client onboarding? Is it fraud and anti-money laundering checking? Is it releasing working capital? Is it speeding up the payment cycle? Or is it managing risk through the trade cycle? Please choose your preferred one. There are many different benefits that the digitalization can bring, but I think these are definitely some of the key benefits that we can see from our side. I'll give you a few more moments to vote. Okay, could you put the results, please, up so we can see what is the feeling of everyone about the benefits? Do you have the results? Excellent. Very interesting to see there as well. So the most popular is definitely speeding up the payment cycle. That's nearly a third of you. And I think a lot of the innovations we're going to look at in this session are all about achieving that ultimate aim. But of course, perhaps the biggest barrier is the client onboarding and KYC. 17% of you have picked that one out. And also everything about fraud and AML checking as well. Very, very big issues there. Ultimately, we want to be able to manage risk through the trade cycle. Nearly a quarter of you looked at that. And of course, all of these pieces come together when you get the technology working with the systems that you have in place. Great. Well, we'll get back to those questions. So let me now just give an opening presentation, just looking at digitalization in trade finance. So the first thing to say is that Africa has passed the digital tipping point. If we go back only 20 years, maybe 1% of Africans had a mobile phone. Now it's nearly everyone. If you look at this data from the International Telecommunications Union, you can see that mobile subscriptions, they reached 985 million in 2022. They are over 1 billion now. And you can see the red line there as well, 3G. Pretty much everyone has 3G as well. Mobile broadband is also catching up, but that has been a bit more expensive. But we saw with the impact of the pandemic, which drove digitalization, and the fact that handsets are much cheaper now, it's much easier to connect. We very much have a digitalized Africa. And if you look at on the ground in Africa, Africa's reality is digital. It could be the old lady paying for some food at a shebeen in South Africa on the top left, top right, topping up your M-Pesa in Kenya, bottom left in West Africa, a shea butter cooperative of women who are talking with the port to work out when they can make their deliveries, or bottom right, a tea farmer in Malawi trying to check the price in the Mombasa auction. Digital is become very, very normal for many parts of Africa. But at the same time, we mustn't get ahead of ourselves. The reality is there's still a long way to go with digitalization, particularly when we're talking about the actual economy on the ground. All of the traders, the ones who feed into and out of these big trade finance deals we do. This is a selection of photographs from my travels to different markets in West Africa. If you look at the two images on the middle top and the top right, they're both from Ghana, the Tudu and Kantamantu markets, all in cash. If you look the bottom middle, that's a trader in Lomé in Togo. Top left is actually Mercato market in Addis Ababa. The important thing about all of these is there's a huge amount of cash which is still transacted. If you look at the bottom left, that is a photograph I took through the window of the car when I was going to Kantamantu market in Accra. And those guys on the motorbike are called Susu. I'm sure many of you know that. They, if you like, are informal bankers. They collect the cash from the traders, nearly always women. They take it away. In fact, very often they deposit it in a bank. They look after it and then eventually return it to the trader later, minus a small commission. We estimated that those guys on the bike were probably carrying up to $50,000 in CDs, and there are hundreds of these trips that occur every day. So cash is still very much king, and that is one side that we have to understand, the difficulty of the barrier with digitalizing trade finance if ultimately it's going to go into cash. That raises issues about translating from digital to cash, but also issues around KYC, around fraud and traceability. But then, of course, there's the reality that trade finance is mostly manual and mostly paper-based. All of us know this, whether it's a bill of lading, it's an LC, it's a contract, an invoice. All of them have to match up. There's a process for issuing these, reviewing these, and authorizing them. And one of the first things I learned in trade finance is it's all about documents. If the document is not there, the goods don't move, the payments are not made. But too much of this is still a question of people signing a document and sending it in the post or sending a PDF. And in fact, there's a lot of processes which are manual, people having multiple different spreadsheets as well. This is a huge barrier to the speed of trade finance as well. This is where digitalization can help. But also, there are the huge concerns around AML and KYC. If you look at the map on the left, that is the latest map actually from the Sanction Scanner dating back to June this year. There is the FATF, who basically combat international trade fraud. They have a blacklist. Fortunately, no African countries on it, but there are 12 African countries on the grey list, as they call it, which is just as bad in the sense that it immediately raises a red flag, and there are many other concerns there. And this, of course, is blocking the ability to do trade finance. But how do you get around these issues? You need really good data. You need to prove your case. And of course, too often that data is lacking. And so if you look on the right, that is actually the findings of a study done by the African Development Bank, looking at the key reasons that SME traders have their LC requests denied. Now, partly that is actually to do with balance sheet constrictions. You can see that we have a balance sheet constraint around 13%, also single obligor limit, insufficient limits in the bank. This is definitely something which is a problem. But if we look there, 40% of the reason is given as client credit worthiness. And what does that really mean? If a client is not credit worthy, it means lack of information. We simply don't understand what is the flow of the goods, what is the background of the client, who are their clients and their clients' clients. Have we covered all the risks? And so very often the answer simply comes back from the credit committee, no. Too high a risk without specification. So these are huge barriers to overcome. But the next wave of technology, I think, really could deliver something. And we're going to look at a lot of these technologies in this session today, because the way they are delivered is different from previous times. Now, a lot of you will know about blockchain. I'm sure you heard a lot about it. It's also known as distributed ledger technology, or DLT. This was hyped as the ultimate solution to everything. Well, it's not, but there are some great solutions it does have for trade finance. There's also what we could call trade tech, the technology for trade tech, which is really how do we apply these different technologies and innovations to trade flows. But of course, we're now thinking about things like the Internet of Things, IoT, APIs, and the ability to connect to the cloud, and the big watchword at the moment, artificial intelligence, which I'm going to touch on as well. So why don't we start by looking at blockchain and cryptocurrencies? As you probably know, most banks and actually most regulators do not want to touch cryptocurrencies when it comes to cross-border payments. There's so many concerns around KYC and AML that it's just a non-starter, but they are extremely useful for micropayments. There are 3 companies, in fact, BitPesa, Stellar, and XRP, and these are used widely by businesses. And it's almost counterintuitive, but a technology as complex as blockchain is actually ideal for micropayments. So, for example, you might want to make a payment to 10,000 nurses in Ethiopia or in Tanzania, let's say. Well, how would you do this? You could do that with a crypto straight to their mobile wallet. And the key thing is that there's no barrier there. It's instant. There's no cost as well. There's no transaction fee. Equally, you might have an NGO that wants to pay a number of its staff all over Africa. Again, cryptos could be very good for this, but it hasn't really been proven as a case for large-scale payments simply because of the concerns around KYC and background checks on the people who are making the payments. But where there's something really interesting, I think, about blockchain is this idea of tokens. When you have a block of the chain of information, you create a token, and all the information underneath is uncorruptible and can't be hacked, which means it's perfect for disintermediating assets. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'll give you one example. There's a company called Goldmint. What if you were living in Africa, you want to buy gold, that is a natural store of value, but you don't want to have it on you. You want to have it somewhere safe. Well, with Goldmint in Africa, you could buy gold that is sitting in the Bank of England in London. And so you have a crypto linked to a specific part of that gold. That means you can be anywhere in the world and you could draw on that, but your gold is safe. And remember, you don't have to buy a bar of gold, which is about $1 million. You could buy $1 worth of it as well. And as a crypto, you can cut it up short. Now, this has been recognized by many of the trade financiers. There's already 2 companies out there, CCRM and Trade Finance Market. They specifically take a trade finance package. It might be a number of different trade finance deals where everything is wrapped up in security, and then they break it up into tokens. And you could buy $100 or $1,000 or $10,000 and essentially invest in these different assets. There's also the opportunity to use invoice discounting. This is what iPopulous does. They have their own token. And there's even, for example, a receivables exchange in India, RXIL. You can put your receivables on there, but it's using cryptos that you transfer the values between them. So certainly for disintermediation of assets, it's a great idea. There's a lot you could do there. And the thing is, if you've gone to all the work with a trade finance deal and packaged it so you have the security and the visibility of what you want in the package, well, then using cryptos, you can chop it up. You could have dozens of different potential investors all drawing on that same level of digital trust. But perhaps the most interesting part, I think, for what blockchain can do is when it comes to customer onboarding and KYC. This company is one example. It's called Tradle. They started in the sandbox of the Bank of England in the UK. And what a sandbox means is you're allowed to experiment digitally, but you have the blessing of the central bank. How it works, Tradle, is the idea is, as a customer, you only do your KYC once. We all know the situation. A customer goes to a bank, KYC process. They go to a different department of the same bank, another KYC process, again and again and again. With Tradle, once you join them, you have a very simple app and you gradually upload the information. It could be passport details. It could be the financials of the bank. It could be, of the client. It could be a company registration, etc. All of the documents go on there, all of them are checked and verified, and then essentially are stored in the blockchain. So when you go to a bank that accepts Tradle and they say, we want to do KYC, you give them your Tradle number, they give you a screen and say, can we access these 16 data points? You say, yes, bam, KYC done, let's talk business. But also you can update information so well. If somebody on the deal, let's say they change their passport, instead of having to send 12 avialized copies to everyone, you upload the new passport, which is verified, and everyone on the deal gets a message saying, new passport uploaded. You check it. If you're part of the group, they're allowed to. And if you had a problem, you could say, I want to have a paper copy. But the ability of this is amazing because it means every time there needs to be a check, everyone who is part of the group who's allowed to has instant access to the key documentation, which is verified. And at the end of this, if the customer goes to another bank, they can just say, access the documentation. So it's a very, very strong user case, I think, for the use of blockchain because it's about digital trust. But then there are some amazing ways that you can, if you like, tie it all together. This is an example from South Africa. One of the biggest problems in South Africa for miners is cash flow. If you get the ore, you dig it out of the ground, you put it in a truck and you send it to a smelter. This is an example of Royal Bafokeng Platinum in South Africa. When the actual ore arrives, it might be 6 to 8 weeks before you're paid. But if you set up the process properly with blockchain, what can happen is the truck itself, when it leaves the mine, it's photographed, you have information about who the driver is, etc. And when it actually gets to the smelter, it drives onto a scale. Photographs are taken of the truck, automatic recognition of the number plate, and it's also weighed as well. And then using an algorithm, it calculates how much ore is in there and a payment's made. So what is the difference there? The payment is made by a smart contract, which is in the blockchain. And the difference is you go from 6 to 8 weeks to get paid to being paid before the truck has even driven off the scale, instant. That kind of difference, speeding up a payment cycle to instantly, is incredibly powerful. And of course, they have checks and balances. They check various different shipments. If they see there's a fraud, someone's been mixing rocks in there, they know who drove the car, the truck, they know when it arrived, they know all the details. So a very powerful example of how you can knit it all together. But by far the most, this has raised the question, of course, could blockchain take over the whole payment cycle? Because we've got LCs, they could go in there, bills of lading, warehouse receipts, invoices, they could all fit into the blockchain. But the truth is, blockchain is very expensive. There's no other way of saying it. It's relatively slow. It's a difficult technology to deploy at scale, particularly if we're talking about SME traders. And so I think the most important thing there is to understand that probably blockchain is going to be much more for big companies. But I'll be asking my fellow speaker on this panel her views on that a bit later. The reality is it's all in the cloud. This is really how sessions work nowadays, or how the technology works today. In the old days, if you wanted to digitalize, it would be a huge process. A truck would arrive with loads and loads of IT and infrastructure. You'd have to install it all. You'd have to change from one system to another. It could be a nightmare. We all know those IT efficiency projects which never deliver efficiency. But in the cloud, all you need is a computer, an internet connection, and that's it. You access the computing power of the planet. And because there are a lot of examples of software as a service, SaaS, as an SME, you could pay $10 a month and you have access to a platform which crunches all of your data. It might visualize your flows physically. It might organize all of your financial data for you. There are so many products you can connect to if you are in the cloud. And what is going to underpin Web 3.0 is everything around big data and AI. Now, big data and algorithms have been around for a very long time, but AI, artificial intelligence, is taking it to the next level. But if I just give you an idea, even just using basic algorithms, there are some very good examples of how they work. One, for example, is AI used by the anti-money laundering company Hummingbird. So one of the things that you'll know if you are an MLRO, if you have to be constantly looking for money laundering, is most of the alerts that you receive are what they call false positives. In other words, there's an alert and you look, oh no, that's nothing serious. To give one example, someone writing in an address might write the letters ST instead of writing out the word street. That comes up as an alert. And obviously, it's a bit of a waste of time for MLROs if most of the alerts they get are false. In fact, it's estimated that probably it could be as high as 99 out of 100 alerts are actually false positives. But if you use AI and Hummingbird, it can essentially build, using all the information, it can build an understanding of criminal behavior, and it can immediately start cutting down the number of false positives. And over a period of time, they can reduce it to less than 5 in 100. Think of the amount of time that saves to the MLRO, who can then focus on what are genuine concerns and then bring their expertise. Another example is Data Robot on the right there. They can crunch all the data and say, look, you might have imperfect data on, let's say, all of your SME traders, but we can fill in the blanks because we're using the computing power of the planet, and we can tell you these are 3 main things that you need to look out for. So they don't have any problem, these systems. If you have, 5,000 databases full of different information, they just say, bring it on. If you have a KYC checklist, which is 120 long, bring it on, no problem. Incredibly powerful these systems are. But what is particularly interesting is the way that AI is going mainstream. And I want to finish talking about this. Many of you will know that we already have chatbots. They're quite normal on phones. They all run on AI. We also have automatic credit scoring. This is particularly big when it comes to the retail world. And then, of course, there's ChatGPT. And let's be honest, quite a few people are using this already to do everything from analysis of deals to actually writing reports. But AI has many uses. For example, in the technology world, they were trying to think what kinds of crystals or what shapes could we use for the next generation of computers. Their engineers came up with 12 examples. DeepMind AI came up with 2.2 million in only a few minutes. But it can even be used for early spotting of things like cancer. If you look at the picture there on the right, that sadly is actually someone who was scanned for lung cancer, which was fatal. But when they put the scans from the previous year through the machine, the AI picked out exactly the same spot. You see that red dot? 1 year beforehand, when the expert didn't. So for early treatment, incredibly powerful. But ultimately, we want to be thinking about using it for trade finance. And what's really interesting, particularly things like ChatGPT, is what they call large language models, LLMs. And that's what we're used to now. You put in some questions, it comes back with answers, and it's getting better and better at a frightening rate. So if you look at the graph there, you only had to go back to the first version of ChatGPT and Llama 2 as well, and it had the average IQ of someone with a university degree, about 126. Where we currently are in the middle, things like ChatGPT 4, Llama 3, Gemini, it's now at the level of someone who's got a general PhD. And we're not far from getting to the point where GTP5 is expected to be better than someone who is a domain expert. So it's a very powerful tool to draw on, but be warned. What AI does is basically hallucinate. And this question of hallucinated data is tricky. What we mean by hallucinating is when you ask it a question, you will always get a different answer each time you ask, because it's looking for different information and is trying to give you what you want. And the problem is, if it can't find what you want, it will make it up. And here's just one example of where it went all wrong. There was a case in the USA brought against Avianca, and the lawyer was trying to find, who was suing them, was trying to find previous examples of airlines. And so he asked ChatGPT, give me examples of airlines where this kind of thing has happened before. And he put in like airlines in developing markets. And it came back with cases including China Southern Airlines, Egypt Air. Great. So we sent it into the court, and the other opposition lawyer says, we're not familiar with these cases. Can you send us the case documents? So this lawyer asked ChatGPT, who produced them, sent them in. But when they got to court, they found that the judge was absolutely furious because none of these cases existed. ChatGPT made them up. It couldn't find the precedents that were needed, but it thought, well, this is likely and this is likely. And so basically the lawyer had produced a complete lie to court. So the case was thrown out, they were fined. I think the lawyer might have been disbarred. But the end thing that he said, I didn't realize that it hallucinates. I thought it was a super search engine. He thought it was like Google. Well, it's not. AI can make it up. So you really need to have that in mind if you're going to try and use this kind of data, because that is one of the big dangers. If you imagine, for example, you say, I need some background on this company. If it can't find it, it might make it up. You might suddenly think that this person who you're looking into actually was involved in something that they never were. So be warned on AI and large language models. But where it is extremely useful, AI, is in these processes. And so to finish, this is just one example from IBM. If you look on the left, the customer submits the documents. This might be an invoice, a bill of lading, and it goes through the process. The document is converted from physical to data. It's then classified automatically. Values are extracted and compared with other ones. ML, all the scrutiny checks occur as well. And if during the process is a problem, a digital assistant called Watson goes back to the human who's there and says, oh, there's a problem with this, or why have you not submitted that? Once it's done, there is a sanity check, and then it goes through an API, and that might result in a payment or an exchange of documentation. So this ability to automate is incredibly powerful. This is what could actually really change the way that trade finance is done and make your life much easier. But ultimately, it's all about choosing the right kind of technology out there. So I'm going to leave it there. And I think just see if there's any immediate questions. We don't have any questions at the moment. So maybe I think what I'll do then is if we lead straight on to my speaker, if I could introduce her, Niama, sorry. Here we are. Yes. Sorry, Niama El Bassouni, who's the CEO of Ways to Cap and ATEX as well. And maybe, Niama, if you could introduce yourself and then give your presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? Excellent. A pleasure to be here today. So I'm Niama El Bassouni, CEO of Ways to Cap. At Ways to Cap, we built a B2B marketplace focusing on cross-border trade, and obviously the trade finance element was a key part of that. And at the moment, we're also operating the Africa Trade Exchange, which is a B2B marketplace that is part of the Africa Trade Gateway, a digital solution gateway that's been built by Afreximbank. And so in today's conversation, the goal is really to look at how the landscape in trade finance and how digitalization can address some of those challenges that we're seeing in trade finance. Essentially, the question is, can fintechs and the technologies that are out there, can they facilitate trade finance so that the access to financing increase, or perhaps the time to financing reduces through this technology? And obviously, I think that the main message here is there isn't a magical solution that once launched will resolve all the trade finance gap and make trades happen, in seconds, at least not in the near future. But there are things that can be done to address some of these challenges in the short term, in the medium term, and the long term. Obviously, these require a lot of stakeholders around it, but at least as first steps are done, these can serve as a foundation to help evolve that landscape in trade finance. Am I able to move through the slide?
You should be able to. Are you sharing? You are sharing, are you?
So one of the sort of the way we could think about trade finance, if you would sort of bucket two key challenges, there's obviously the access to capital element, and there's the compliance requirements. So these two challenges revolve around this idea, first of all, of trust. I mean, trust is the pinnacle of trade. Trade happens when there is trust, and obviously that comes in multiple facets. So we're talking about stakeholder trust, and essentially the question is the stakeholder that I'm dealing with the stakeholder they say they are? Is this a supplier? Is this a buyer? Is this a legitimate stakeholder counterparty? So this element of trust is so key in trade finance because, and how we think about its legislation, Because often, you'll hear things like, oh, I need to meet someone face-to-face, and does that make it mutually exclusive to using digital platforms to do that? The question is no, but these are why a lot of that trust, that stakeholder trust, is key to resolve as we think about digital solution. And obviously, there's other things like product quality trust. Can I trust the product quality that this supplier is going to send? Payment trust. Can a supplier trust that a buyer will make that payment? Delivery trust, and I think the list goes on. But essentially, the sort of message here is trust is a key challenge, because you want to be able to trust your counterparties. You want to be able to trust the transaction that's going to happen, whether from the product or payment side, and you want to be able to trust all those elements underlying it, and trust the data that you're accessing about the stakeholders and so forth, to be able to progress in a transaction. And obviously, there's been a whole non-digital ecosystem that's been built around trade. I mean, trade has existed for thousands of years, and whether things like conferences and trade fairs and bilateral trips, or even the different types of companies like third-party verification companies on the ground, agencies, etc. So all these non-digital ecosystem players have a main goal, which is to increase trust. But digital solutions can also play a large role in that, because when used properly, digital solutions can make it faster, they can make it cheaper, and in a lot of ways, sometimes actually safer, in terms of traceability and fraud detection and other elements that should increase trust over time in these solutions. And the other part is compliance requirements. So often that credit worthiness of an SME, where financing gets rejected or not, is linked to compliance data, which can also be linked to the fact that there's a data availability issue, there's a data access issue, and there's also perhaps a data process issue, which is some of the things that Ted was speaking about earlier when it comes to using AI and machine learning and KYC solutions to streamline these processes, and essentially facilitating and helping access data that is more trustworthy, but also making that data more available. A lot of data exists manually, it exists on paper, it exists in different kind of data sets. What a lot of these technologies do, it brings these data together and allows an onboarding process to happen, to allow for these compliance requirements to be fulfilled, and also in a way facilitating that trade finance element. And so fintechs can play a huge role in enabling trust, efficiency, and data to essentially help with trade finance. With trust, as I was sort of mentioning earlier, it really is about goods, it's about payments, and that falls into the sort of stakeholder element in terms of, can I trust the stakeholders? Can I trust its payment? Is there a way, can I trust a dispute resolution framework that can be used if something goes wrong? And essentially being able to integrate a lot of these parts of the value of the trade finance value chain to create more trust for the stakeholders using digital solutions. And fintechs, because of the technologies they're building, can play a huge role in it. Efficiency is also really key here, because what efficiency does, obviously, is not only does it streamline these processes and how we handle them, it can reduce costs. And this is especially critical when we're dealing with transactions where margins are smaller. So any of these cost reductions can suddenly facilitate that trade. And also this idea that it can make it more efficient in terms of access to distribution, in terms of sales, and access to information, especially for SMEs. For a lot of SMEs, the access to information can be extremely costly as compared to sort of larger corporates. And this is where fintechs can, in a way, democratize a lot of that access through the solutions they're building, by enabling more streamlined processes, but also by providing better or more accessible communication tools that allow for this sort of trade finance gap to be reduced through these solutions. And when we think about data, it is about availability, it's about access, it's about authenticity. So sort of these 3 A's that sort of make often even more, even especially so for SMEs, one, to either be seen as a credit-worthy corporation, because it can't just be that the access to their data, the access to their information is limited, but also just generally for financial institutions or banks or whatnot to make credit decisions, the lack of access to data or available data that can be accessed in a cheap way, or in a cheaper way at least, often has a big impact on the assessment of the financing opportunities. And so with these fintechs that are working on providing solutions where this access to data is more available, is more authentic, is more transparent, and just more readily available generally, means that these systems can be integrated and incorporated into a lot of the decision-making processes for a lot of these FIs and banks, and hence means that they can start processing and in a way making better decisions for credit requests coming from SMEs. So what I'll just sort of go through now is a few examples of how these fintechs can build digital trust and increase access to capital. So when we look at financing or access to financing, there's obviously digital lending platforms that focus on the working capital element. And so what these fintechs try to do are provide fast, flexible, and scalable lending options for SMEs. And so, when in the first poll that was done earlier, a big part of it was essentially how digital solutions should be able to reduce that cycle or the time frame to make those decisions. So these lending platforms can do that and are working towards doing that, to essentially give a quicker access to working capital without necessarily the need for lengthy bank approval processes. This doesn't mean that decisions need to be made in a way that is not sort of constructed on proper credit scoring models. It's just technologies are now being built to enable even sort of a more risk assessment to be done in a shorter period of time. And this, what this can do for a lot of SMEs is obviously provide immediate liquidity when needed. Another sort of main theme that a lot of fintechs are addressing is the ability to do so through mobile-based solutions. So for a lot of these fintechs are essentially enabling SMEs to access financing throughout the supply chain. So it could be from logistics, it could be to purchase inventory, it could be for ongoing lending to their customers without necessarily being constrained by geographical barriers. And this mobile supply part is also a way, once again, to make it more accessible, because those are often the technologies and the tools and phones are what a lot of the SMEs are using in their day-to-day. So bringing that to a mobile-based solution means that digitalization is helping towards increasing the access to capital. And so these are two examples of solutions that have been provided. So for example, there's the African Bank Trade Link solution. So that's essentially a solution that's done for the supply chain financing part, where it's integrated in a lot of financial institutions to be able to provide working capital in a much sort of, I guess, more effective way, but using different mechanisms to do it to shorten that process. Lenda is another example. In Nigeria, they focus more on the SMEs and retailers within country, but the idea is that can be transposed across geographies. And there it's very much about being able to access financing quicker, because you're building up a transaction history, a credit history that can be easily accessible, and also sort of trying to streamline a lot of the onboarding and compliance process from the beginning that can be used over and over again. So essentially these embedded financing solutions, as we think about it, can make it that while these fintechs can also obviously exist on a standalone basis, they can also integrate into B2B platforms through an embedded solution. And this ability to actually integrate through embedded solution means that these solutions can become prevalent. They can be everywhere. So in any B2B platform, they can embed a financing solution within them, meaning that more and more SMEs are able to access this funding at the point of need, rather than trying to find a solution. So they can be on a platform and they can basically find somewhere that says, oh, request financing, and go through the process through that embedded solution, rather than needing financing and trying to find these digital solutions. So that embedded mechanism means that it can sort of just be distributed a lot widely, making that capital a lot more accessible and the process even more streamlined as per the sort of transaction lifecycle. So essentially, by removing a lot of these sort of financing barriers and sort of traditional methods of doing it, and introducing these flexible solutions that are, I guess, more technology driven, this can play a significant role in increasing this access to capital. And once again, it's not about replacing solutions, it's about enhancing them to make sure that the access to capital is more, I guess, inclusive for SMEs. Another key part of the digital trust and increasing access to capital through fintech solutions is looking at the automation, efficiency, and transparency part of the process. And so I think I sort of mentioned it earlier. Communication tools are really important here. Just looking at WhatsApp, through WhatsApp APIs and chat bots and all the various sort of kind of plugins that have now been developed over around WhatsApp means that communication now is more accessible, and this streamlining of communication can actually increase access to capital because there's more information that's available, there's more trust that's being created. So rather than trying to always create sort of completely new platforms, we can take what people or what SMEs are using today and WhatsApp being a big part of it and build around it to streamline the process, to streamline the communication, to use it as a way essentially to increase trust, but also find a way to integrate it even into sort of mobile solutions that provide financing and so forth. So creating more instant and reliable ways to conduct trade finance. And so this whole communication angle is pretty critical here to build on top of it to create more of that digital trust. Obviously, workflow automation and paperless processes is something that Ted touched upon earlier, but essentially by automating workflows in trade finance, this can reduce manual errors and increase essentially processing speed, and by reducing this dependency on paper-based methods, a lot of the operational efficiency for both financiers and SMEs improve. Blockchain is also a key one here, so it can introduce a new layer of transparency and trust within the trade finance ecosystem, not only by having this sort of immutable record of transactions, but also it can reduce fraud risks and giving both suppliers and buyers greater confidence in their transactions. And obviously, with a lot of the blockchain, I guess, use cases, the key challenges, and I'm sure it's something we'll touch upon later, is about getting engagement and getting buy-in from a lot of these stakeholders. But once again, I think with a lot of these things, as we think through them, it's not only always about finding a solution that resolves everything, it can be steps to start resolving things. So short-term, medium-term, and long-term steps. And obviously through also automation and efficiency, this means that there are faster credit decisions that can be made through automation and using things like invoice financing, but also integrating them into sort of more kind of, I guess, technology-driven credit scoring methods, allowing SMEs to once again secure funding faster with less friction, but also making sure that more information, more data sets actually can be used to help process those decisions. And here, just briefly, an example, a couple of examples of companies. So Nash is a company based in East Africa, and essentially what they are looking to do is automate a lot of everything that goes from workflows to invoice financing to and with the goal that these can then be used to make effective lending decisions or effective financing decisions or whatnot. So this is just one example. There's a lot of companies like that now emerging that are looking at what we like almost the opposite of fintech to streamline that process, to make it more transparent and efficient and essentially more accessible, so that any fintech, any platform can plug into it and sort of leverage that embedded element or embedded leverage that it can offer. ATEX is so the platform we're operating, and so through ATEX, what we're doing also is looking to automate and make these transactions more efficient and streamlined. And so thinking about what are the workflow automations, how can we leverage and collect data and data from different sets, right? So there's always obviously the sort of traditional financial data that a lot of FIs will look into, which is financial accounts and the usual sort of KYC documents. But there's a whole world out there where SMEs are operating, where data sets can also be leveraged. So whether it's in mobile communication, looking at the transaction history through mobile, looking at things like even like social media and that interaction around that. So a lot more data sources that can be then leveraged and brought together to make these lending decisions. And another sort of big part where fintechs are building or playing a great sort of a very important role is to increase digital trust and access to capital is looking at data and compliance solutions. So going back to that sort of first slide, when we think about the two big challenges, trust and compliance requirements, fintech play a big role here, which is essentially one, improving data availability and reliability for credit decisions. So this ability to integrate these solutions into other lending platforms, which can make a lot of the onboarding process a lot easier because there's this access to data. There's obviously this AI-driven KYC AML compliance that Ted mentioned earlier. And so a lot of AI is streamlining KYC and AML processes are also being automated. And so this verification of this customer identity can be used on a continuous basis to monitor activities. And as you have these platforms, it means a lot of that processing time also decreases to make those decisions, but also enhances security and increases trust overall. So the ability to integrate these solutions, compliance solutions, into lending platforms. So this is really key once again, because as we're getting a lot more of this embedded financing solutions into platforms at the point of need, the ability to integrate these compliance solutions also are key in facilitating the onboarding and streamlining it and doing those KYC checks at that point of need also. And so this not only improves the process, but it also allows lenders to make better credit decisions, which means that we can expand the pool of potential borrowers and hence increase the access to capital. And finally, also just with the solutions, is the ability to enhance credit scoring and decision-making. So a lot of these data-driven credit scoring models and technologies that are being built help improve the accuracy of lending. And so here's our two examples of, and there's a lot more obviously. So there's Comply Advantage. So I wouldn't say this is necessarily an Africa-focused solution, but a global one. But also obviously interacting with African transactions, and they essentially basically on a continuous basis are able to assess KYC and suspicious activities and so forth, so that at the point of need, at the point of where a credit request is made, that information can be accessed. Mansa is also another platform that is a data platform that's looking to bring make it easier to do KYC on a lot of these corporates in Africa by giving them almost a unique ID after they've gone through all the KYC checks. And so this can be then embedded also into other platforms and sort of in a way, just through an API can check into these corporates and be like, okay, this is a corporate that has already gone through this Mansa KYC check. So they've been verified, et cetera, and be able to then access it through multiple sources. Yeah, just finally, essentially the message from this short presentation is really that fintechs and technology can enable trust in B2B trade, and in doing so, they can facilitate and trade finance and increase access to capital. And the key is just to think about it, that this doesn't have to be a solution that resolves everything, but that we can start almost with sort of quicker wins, immediate solutions, that's where we can start seeing these results, and then using those as a way for them to build a foundation sort of for longer term solutions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nyama. Really interesting there as well, because so much of what you said dovetailed with what I said. And I think it also gets back to this central point about finance and banking. It's all about trust. It's and therefore, how can you digitalize that trust? I think what's so interesting about when you're talking about B2B transactions, that's where it's so important to understand who the other business is. Digital could offer that bridge of trust. Because if you think about it, it's still the case in Africa that most trade is handled, or payments are handled, with letters of credit, LCs. And an LC exists because there is no trust between the exporter and the importer, but they more or less trust their banks. Their banks more or less trust each other, and that's how you do it. But I think certainly digital could make a bridge there between the two, the bridge of trust in that sense. We've got 10 minutes for questions, and we've had a number of questions submitted. So I'm just going to start looking at those. One of the first was to me, someone thanking me for the informative presentation and asking, does AI have the capability to detect forged documents that can appear in the whole process? And my answer would be yes, absolutely. In fact, there are a number of systems out there which are working on this. And for example, one thing is simply to do where you feed in a number of documents. Let's say the contract, maybe a bill of lading, maybe an invoice. Does everything match? Do all the addresses match? Do the invoice numbers match? Do the names of the parties match? That's the sort of thing an AI can do extremely quickly. But also you can train an AI, and using your own best knowledge, you can ask it to look for certain inconsistencies that would come in there as well. So I think the point about the AIs is that they very often come to you trained in a certain way, but you want to train them yourself, and you can make them more and more sharp at spotting those things that you are aware of. So there certainly are a number of models out there. I wonder if you want to add anything, Niamh, on that.
No, absolutely. I think AI is a great example generally of how it can be used for that sort of risk assessment. And part of that risk assessment is looking at the fraudulent, are documents fraudulent? And obviously, and I think, and blockchain can also play a role on top of that too, in terms of documentation. So I think the combination of both can be very powerful in creating that bridge of trust and reliability of information, but also decreasing fraud and increasing trust.
Yeah. And the interesting thing here as well is, as I've noted with talking to a number of people who are involved in automating fraud check, for the really good spotting of fraud, you need the expert. You need people like yourselves who are currently online, who know your markets. You know how the market works, how the country works. You can immediately say, for example, you might look at a contract which says they're going to unload everything at a certain port, and you'll be like, hold on, that port doesn't have the capacity to unload anything like that. How could that possibly be the case? Maybe an AI wouldn't pick that up. So I certainly think in the case of MLROs and the very senior fraud detectors, AI is a great tool, but it will never replace them because it's that on-the-ground knowledge which is so critical. But actually, this comes back to a question about data, and this is one for you, Niamh. We had another question here. Accuracy of data is key in order to use AI. That is why the 3 A's mentioned in the presentation are so important. What sources do you think there are in West and Central Africa to get this kind of data we need so we have trust and assurance?
That's a great question, and I think
that's a difficult question.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and I think this is where a lot of the fintechs, and I don't think not that I know of at least, that there's one source of data, because I think if that existed, that would resolve a lot of issues. I think what a lot of fintechs are trying to do, at least, is through open banking, which obviously isn't as prevalent, through tapping into credit bureaus, through transactional data. So through whatever platforms they're building, whether it's direct or whether it's as part of an embedded mechanism, they're trying to bring those to digitize those data and essentially then be able to provide it as a service, data as a service to those who want to access it. So I've come across a lot of fintechs and where they're just focused, for example, on the onboarding process and want to create an onboarding identity. So I met one a couple of weeks ago, and they're just launching, and that's their main focus in that data part. So I think because data is so vague, there's different types of data that needs to be accessed. There's data for onboarding, there's data on which part of it is about the data of stakeholders, but it can be transactional data, it can be trade data, and as Ted was saying earlier, it could be data about port capacity. Is that reliable? And I think as that data obviously is coming, a lot of it is coming from that human knowledge, as we're bringing that data more into the language models or infrastructure and whatnot, then that information will then be able to be leveraged. So I don't think there's one source of data, there's different sources of data. And because it's quite fragmented, this is where a lot of these fintech solutions are trying to bring it to reduce at least that level of fragmentation of data that can be used at different parts of the cycle.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And just on that point, to add to that, and there are some really good companies out there trying to build that data repository. For example, Asoko Insight is one of them.
Yeah.
They're trying to be the company's House of Africa. They already cover 15 of the major economies in Africa, and they have thousands of companies on there. And so you can go in and look at the company. Okay, where is it based? When was it last audited? Did it submit its accounts? Who are the directors? Who are the owners? All those kind of questions. So they are out there.
Exactly,
Well,
and actually, just quickly on
sorry,
that, yeah, like the one that I mentioned earlier, Mansa, do that, but for the KYC part, for example, that data KYC part, they go through all the data KYC document collection and so forth to then be able to create a unique identifier that sort of anyone can plug into. And so I think there are quite a few who are approaching it from different angles. But I think what's going to happen is a lot of them will offer their part as an embedded solution, an API solution that different sort of platforms and companies and FIs can plug into based on what they need in the transaction lifecycle.
Absolutely, yes. Now, it's a good point to make on Mansa because that's so critical for trade finance. Well, we're almost out of time, but we have time for one more question and just this poll, which I think would be good to do, because often when we talk about we need to digitalize, we have to face the reality, but there are barriers. We can't just click our fingers and digitalize. So if you look at the poll on there, in your opinion, this is to everyone, what is the greatest barrier to digital adoption in West and Central Africa? Is it the high cost of digital products and platforms? Is it the lack of robust energy and digital infrastructure, power cuts and lack of 3G? Is it the lack of awareness of what digital solutions can deliver? Do people just not know? Is it the language barrier? Too much in English, not enough in French? Or is it the time and effort required for a digital transition? The institution's just like, I can't do this. I want to stick with what we've got. So please vote on that, what you think the key barrier is, and then we'll share our views as well.
So Ted, in the meantime, could we ask questions from the room? We have two questions.
Yes, certainly, fine. So there's one more. This is quite a complicated one, but I think it's really interesting. We've had questions really about the about the legal environment, if you like, and the regulatory environment. A number of questions posed here, but the big question here is, how ready is West and Central Africa to accept digitalization? Do the laws and the regulations allow it? Are the governments and the regulators on board with it? So maybe if I answer initially on that, Nyama, you can give your views as well. I think the important point to say is that there has been a huge amount of progress from regulators and governments to accept digitalization. Ultimately, it comes down to the different markets. So if you take somewhere such as, let's say, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, I'm talking here West Africa, the regulators there are very open to digital innovation. The most important thing is to talk to them about it. They all have the equivalent of sandboxes where these different technologies can be tried out. And as I mentioned before, they're generally very nervous about blockchain because of or particularly cryptos, but they're not, they don't have a problem with the other digital solutions there as well. So I was actually working on a project earlier this year about a digital economy index where we were looking at the readiness of the regulatory regime. And I think the general point is that they are trying to catch up. Very often regulation is not at the same level as the innovation because it's going ahead of it, but they are open to it. And ultimately, if you are a digital innovator, you have to be speaking to the regulator and the government from the start to make sure you're allowed to do it. Do you want to offer your views on that one, Niam?
No, I think that's that, and I think it's something I think this is also where fintechs can come up with innovative solutions, and innovation in a lot of ways finds what the regulation is today, and it's a question of trying to find ways that obviously you're respecting it, but you're still trying to create solutions, and so regulation never goes at the same speed as a solution. So it's just kind of a fine balance where I think fintechs can take a big role in that to make sure that they can test solutions, bring solutions to market while the regulation catches up.
That's great, fine. Yeah, sorry, Mo, you said there were two live questions. Very happy to take one of them. Is that someone who wants to ask the question live? Or were you saying that those are the questions on the queue?
Yeah, we do have two questions from the room. I'll start by, with Toby and then Connie, please.
Okay, thank you, Francis. Neema, my question is to you. On your slide where you said fintechs are building digital trust and increasing access to capital. So the first part of that statement is quite confusing to me because are we looking at it from the view of the clients or from the view of the banks, you know? Because people will argue that for fintechs, their KYC requirements are quite lax compared to banks, right? I know some fintech companies that are telling you that you can open an account in 5 minutes, international account, right? And it's not as strict, the requirements compared to banks. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that clearly. Thank you.
Sure, and I think it's once again use cases. For banks, and it's something I mentioned earlier, it isn't necessarily, it's not about sort of replacing current processes, it's about enhancing them. So there are a lot of sort of, I guess, AI, machine learning sort of solutions that can be leveraged to enable that, you know, the likes of Comply Advantage and other platforms that enhance and enable that KYC process and make it quicker. Obviously with fintechs, especially when they're starting, a lot of them, and as you rightly so are more lax. That doesn't mean that, you know, a startup, a fintech that's starting now will be used tomorrow by a bank and will be able to sort of trust its capabilities. But as that fintech progresses, as its requirements become less lax, which often happens as these fintechs start to gain greater distribution and size, then that will kind of fall more in line with some of that more stringent requirements of FIs and banks, especially when it comes to sort of larger B2B transactions. So I'd say, you know, you're working from like kind of opposite sides of the spectrum, and these technologies try to bring it together, you know. So the message here isn't that you're gonna, as a bank, trust the most lax, you know, KYC requirements of these fintechs, but a lot of these fintechs, the likes of Comply Advantage and others, are actually now significant sort of players in the ecosystem, and their requirements, for example, follow a lot of the FIs all over the world, whether it's US or UK based and so forth. So, but what they've done is they brought technologies that make that process easier and quicker and often more accurate because they're able to leverage different data sets. So it depends on use cases, but it's not to sort of say, you know, a KYC process should be more lax. It's just about how can we make them more accurate, how can we make them faster, and how can we make them less costly so that even SMEs can benefit from them based on their transaction sizes and so forth.
That's great. Thanks, Niama.
Thank you.
Yeah, we got time for just one more question, and we'll give very quick answers because I know we're over time.
Yes, thank you. No, ma question, je vais la poser en français. Merci encore à toi, Niama, pour cette brillante présentation sur la digitalisation. La majeure partie des participants à cet atelier, qui est très important, en fait, sont des banquiers, en fait, donc des professions. Je pense que la préoccupation serait de savoir, d'un point de vue loi et harmonisation, n'est-ce pas, des pratiques, quelle est l'évolution au niveau international? De façon concrète, aujourd'hui, on sait que la digitalisation est un processus qui a déclenché depuis les années 70. Initialement, tout ce qui était LC se faisait de façon manuelle et avec les courriers. On est arrivé à l'étape de SWIFT. Aujourd'hui, le processus se poursuit. Donc, ma question est de savoir concrètement, en termes de harmonisation, avec, n'est-ce pas, tout ce qui est en cours actuellement en termes, n'est-ce pas, de réformes, notamment les modèles law on electronic transferable code, quel est le niveau de progression? Est-ce qu'il y a des pays africains qui sont concernés par ce processus? Parce qu'il y a différentes initiatives, des plateformes, mais qui sont plus en réalité des blocs fermés que des initiatives qui parlent à tout le monde. Vous avez évoqué, n'est-ce pas, le coût, n'est-ce pas, d'entrer, n'est-ce pas, dans la blockchain, mais de façon factuelle et pratique aujourd'hui, quel est l'état des lieux pour donner une idée assez nette et claire, n'est-ce pas, aux participants? Merci.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I don't know if we can possibly answer it in the short time that we have. It's so complicated. I think the main thing to say is that where harmonization is occurring is at a regional level. So if we look at the CFA franc zone and we look at the central banks, they are quite harmonized in their approach to this one as well. If we look at ECOWAS as well, they are going for a harmonized approach. But I mean, ultimately, it comes down to the regulator in the individual country. But in all honesty, I think this is probably a half an hour discussion. I don't know what you think, Niama.
Absolutely, and I think different regions, different countries are, as you said, different sort of stages, and really it's about where they are in that process, and some, you know, yeah, absolutely, it's a long one.
Yeah, but when it comes to harmonization, the short answer is it should definitely be at a regional level. That is my understanding, particularly for West Africa. And certainly when I was working on the digital project, we were talking with essentially the CFA franc zone and the two central banks. That's where we were looking to get the harmonization when it comes to digitalization. I hope that answers your question.
No, merci.
Good. Très bien. Okay, well, we've run out of time. Thank you so much to Nyama for really interesting contribution. We'd have loved to discuss more. There's time for just one short break now of 5 minutes, and then the final session will be kicking off at 12 o'clock GMT. So make sure you're back for then, and then we'll have the wrap up at the end. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you.
Yeah.
Notre dernière session de la journée. Cette session traite de la question de conformité et risque de conformité dans le financement du commerce international. Nous avons ici deux intervenantes, Madame Kada Janzou du groupe financier Atlantique et Madame Fungai Nyamawa de Afrexim Bank. Ce sont deux femmes très expérimentées en matière de conformité. Et je vais commencer déjà par introduire Madame Kada. Elle est directrice de la conformité au groupe financier Atlantique et précédemment directrice de la conformité à la Société Générale Côte d'Ivoire. Elle compte plus de 17 ans d'expérience dans le contrôle interne. Et perhaps I will now switch in English to introduce the other speaker. Mrs. Fungai is a compliance manager at the African Export-Import Bank. She oversees compliance risk management in West Africa, Central Africa, and the Caribbean regions. She has over 26 years of experience in banking, 19 of those with the Africa Export-Import Bank. Each speaker will have 20 minutes for presentation. We'll then have 20 minutes for Q&A session. To the participant, please raise your questions in the chat. You may also indicate to whom your question is directed. I'll now invite Mrs. Fungai for her presentation. Ms. Fungai from Afrexim Bank, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fungai Nyamahowa. I'm serving as compliance manager in Afrexim Bank. As previously said, I would like also to thank my co-speakers and panelists for excellent presentations, and this has really made our job easier. Since section one or the sections in one way or the other, they were discussing compliance. So it shows how much compliance is critical to trade finance in Africa and all our sub-regions. I'll go straight into my presentation. I also want to thank Nyama and George. Also, they covered a lot of ground in terms of what I wanted to say. So in terms of the presentation slides, I will be I'll be flying because most of the aspects have already been covered. For today, we are going to look at compliance risk in trade finance and the challenges and recommendations, and also our interventions. So I would not want to call them challenges per se, because to me, they are opportunities, more opportunities than threats, which will help us to improve the trade finance environment in the continent and also in our various regions and the countries that we operate in. Let's move to the next slide. So also for a change, I just want us to go through this video, and also it also summarizes where we are going and what we're going to talk about, so that when we are explaining, it's easier and it will not take time. Please go ahead. I think we need volume.
Hello, Tanya, we can't hear.
Yes, it seems there's no volume.
You cannot hear the sound for the video?
Yes.
Let me reshare then.
Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel Global Trade Plaza. Today's topic is international trade finance. Specifically, we will discuss international trade finance regulations and compliance. As you know, international trade involves financial transactions between different countries, and to ensure transparency and smooth transactions, certain regulations and compliance measures are put in place. In this video, we will go through the key regulations and compliance measures in international trade finance. Section 1. Regulations in international trade finance. International trade finance is regulated by various bodies such as the International Chamber of Commerce, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund. These organizations establish the rules and regulations that govern trade finance and ensure that the transactions are conducted in a fair and transparent manner. These regulations are aimed at protecting the interests of all parties involved in the transactions, including buyers, sellers, and financial institutions. Section 2. Compliance in international trade finance. Compliance is an essential part of international trade finance, as it ensures that all parties involved in the transactions comply with the regulations established by the regulatory bodies. Compliance measures include anti-money laundering and know your customer procedures, which are aimed at preventing illegal activities such as money laundering and terrorist financing. Other compliance measures include trade embargoes, sanctions, and export control regulations, which restrict the movement of certain goods and services between countries. Section 3. Benefits of compliance in international trade finance. Compliance in international trade finance provides several benefits, including reduced risk of financial crimes, increased transparency, and improved reputation. Financial institutions that comply with the regulations and have effective compliance programs in place are more likely to be trusted by their customers, which can lead to increased business opportunities. Section 4. Challenges in compliance for international trade finance. Despite the benefits of compliance, there are several challenges in implementing and maintaining effective compliance programs in international trade finance. These challenges include the complexity of the regulations, the varying regulatory requirements between countries, and the difficulty in identifying and verifying the identity of customers in different jurisdictions. Conclusion. In conclusion, international trade finance regulations and compliance are critical for ensuring transparency, fairness, and security in global financial transactions. Compliance measures such as AML and KYC procedures, trade embargoes, sanctions, and export control regulations play a crucial role in preventing financial crimes and protecting the interests of all parties involved in the transactions. While there are challenges in implementing effective compliance programs, the benefits of compliance outweigh the challenges, and financial institutions that comply with the regulations are more likely to succeed in the global marketplace.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. You can stop the sharing. Thank you.
Yes, we can go back to the slides. Thank you. Okay, so this slide basically discusses the definitions. We will not dwell much on this, but from the video that we've just watched, we can conclude that compliance is part of trade finance, because there is compliance in every part of the trade finance value chain. And it is also our belief that the risks and challenges which are faced in West Africa, in Central Africa, they are not inferior from the challenges that are faced by the continent as a whole, as an emerging market. Let's move to the next slide. So to sum up the challenges, this slide talks to the complexity of trade finance compliance, where we are saying there is no harmonization, and also trade finance processes are quite complex given the nature of documentation. And if you can see from the from the discussion here, there are several parties and counterparties involved in the transaction value chain of trade finance. So there is also a lot of scrutiny and regulatory scrutiny on the transaction counterparties. It's not like the vanilla transactions that we process in the banks where we debit and credit, but trade finance comes with whole lots of other processes to the vessels, financial institutions, traders, importers and exporters, and as well as documentation. So it is really, and usually the penalty, there are also penalties involved, so it becomes a complex phenomenon in Africa. Let's move to the next slides. Apologies for the hiccup. So in terms of the compliance challenges we have, I've dwelt mostly on the challenges that impact the financial services sector. I know there are other compliance challenges in the screening and also at the borders, but for financial services sector, our challenges are more aligned to regulatory environment, the ever-changing environment and the regulations which are not uniform across the regions. Excuse me. So it is very important for us. We take these challenges as opportunities for improvement. So the regulatory environment also involves documentation and also data privacy issues where information sharing is constrained by the local regulations which govern the country operations before we even speak about the regional operations. And also failure to adhere to regulations, to laws, to policies will also result in enforcement actions against the financial services participants and also the traders. So eventually there will be regulatory fines and sanctions, penalties and fines imposed on regulatory breaches. So these are some of the challenges that are faced in the regulatory space. These are the compliance challenges that are faced in trade finance when it comes to regulation. And also there is another important factor which is more to do with perception-driven compliance. After all the regulations, the heavy regulations that are imposed at country level, at regional level, and at global level, at times as financial institutions, we tend to start adopting more stringent policies, more stringent regulations, which is more like self-sanctioning because of the fear of regulatory fines and sanctions. So these are some of the challenges that are faced in terms of regulation. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you. We also have trade-based financial crimes, which has been discussed at length during this session. Trade-based money laundering is also a challenge that is faced, and we also have limited information whereby we are governed by our local laws in terms of information sharing. So it may also result in us not accessing authentic sources of information because of varying or differing level of maturity in terms of digitization, as our speakers were saying. And also on the financial crime space, it's also a challenge because compliance eventually becomes very expensive. To invest in all the systems and the processes that were discussed, to invest in digitization, it really requires a lot of investment. And most of the times, business is driven by sales and revenues. And compliance being part of the business which does not really generate revenue, it's difficult to convince the management or the board that I want a budget to invest in compliance systems. So these are some of the challenges that are faced from compliance space. And also of late, because of all the evolution of the compliance environment, you tend to see that resources and expertise are required. It is no longer the compliance, the traditional compliance, but now with systems and advanced processes, there's also need to invest in human resource capacities in terms of implementing the AML and CFT programs in our organizations. And lastly, another challenge is on the manual controls. Trade finance is heavy on documentation, is heavy on process. So as long as we are relying on manual controls, we will not get it right because they are prone to errors and conflicts and consume valuable time. So the two slides were discussing about the challenges, but as I said earlier on, for us, it's also, we can term them opportunities for improvement. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. So we was looking at the recommendations or how we can tackle these challenges. We have considered it at a high level, not at financial institution level or at micro level, but we are saying in the continent, what is it that we can do to mitigate against the regulatory and financial crimes risk? And we ask ourselves, in terms of knowledge, are we at the same level? The answer is no. Usually, our understanding and our interpretation of the regulations, especially as they pertain to trade finance, are always varying. So it is important that we work together as Africa and also in our sub-regions and in our countries to increase capacity building initiatives so that we close the knowledge gaps. So one such seminar is also important. We are already attending. It's part of capacity building. And after Eximbank as a multilateral development institution, we have also seminars that we run across the continent on an annual basis or on demand. So it is important to increase capacity building initiatives to close the knowledge gaps. I'll also speak to advocacy for standardization of processes, including documentation requirements. So if we advocate for a platform which standardizes all our processes, and also ensure that the way the trade finance transaction is processed in Central Africa or in a country in Central Africa is the same way that the transaction is processed in West Africa or any other region in Africa. It will help to improve the timelines and the efficiencies of processing of documents, and we will sing the same language as the African continent. It's also important to share information on imaging risks in our various countries and regions, excuse me. Information sharing on imaging risks ensures that wherever we are tackling the same risks as the African continent. I will also give an example when I'm speaking to the interventions that we have done as Afreximbank in terms of improving the compliance environment of trade finance in Africa in the next slides. But information sharing is important, is key for all stakeholders, public, private, and also financial institutions, traders, importers and exporters, and the regulatory bodies. It's also important to have like a repository of regulatory requirements. That way we can all access the same platform on regulations which impact or which affect us and which also affect our the processing of trade finance transactions. I cannot overemphasize on digitization of the trade process to improve compliance monitoring. This was mentioned in the previous sections, so it's also important to go digital. Of course, the processing of trade finance is quite onerous. There's a lot of documentation involved, but with digitization, the processes are streamlined and we'll have more efficient way of processing. Also, to support the full implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, this is just a summary of all these recommendations. Once we have standardization, once we have a central repository of regulations, once we also advocate for standardized processes, and this is what the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is trying to achieve. So it's important that as African partners, as African stakeholders, we support the full implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Let's go to the next slides. We'll also be very brief on them because they've been emphasis on. Let's proceed to the next slide. Okay, so we are saying better compliance, better trade. This is just to summarize the interventions that we have done as a bank. Some have already been discussed. I will not dwell on the Manta platform, but I will just mention the other initiatives that we are taking to close the knowledge gap. We have on-demand training and awareness raising activities for African banks, including in Central Africa and West Africa. During this year, we have already conducted some sessions in Central Africa. We also have the Afreximbank Annual Compliance Forum, which we host in various African countries, and the previous one was in Senegal, where we had more than 300 participants. So the Annual Compliance Forum discusses contemporary compliance issues in Africa, focusing on various themes, including ultimate beneficiary ownership, etc. We also have the Afreximbank Structured Trade Finance for this year. Is going to be held in Namibia, and we have the AFDB program, which which facilitates processing of trade-related payments and transactions. The other ones, I will not venture on them because they've been mentioned earlier. We can move to the next slide. They are also self-explanatory. So we also emphasize on a regulatory relationship management plan where we discuss regulations. As Afreximbank, we have signed memorandum of understanding with the local financial intelligence authorities so that we can exchange information related to compliance matters in Africa, particularly on the financial crimes compliance, and also with the central bank so that we can understand the regulatory environment. I apologize for the glitch, but in a nutshell, this is the presentation that I wanted to make on the challenges that are being faced on the regulatory front and also financial crimes and also the various interventions that we can implement as partners in the trade finance transaction value chain. Thank you very much. I think the next slide, I will address it during the Q&A in terms of the transaction monitoring tools that we have implemented as Afreximbank, and if there's still time. Thank you.
Francis, si vous parlez, on ne vous entend pas.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, no, thank you very much. I was just thanking Mrs. Fungai for the brilliant presentation, and the video does also quite summarize the issues of compliance risk in trade finance. I will get back to you, Mrs. Fungai, during the question and answer session. Nous allons maintenant continuer avec Madame Kada de Atlantic Financial Group. Madame Kada, si vous pouvez présenter.
Bonjour à tous, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, très bien.
Parfaitement. Donc, je vais vous faire l'économie de la présentation de mon parcours qui a déjà été fait par Francis et commencer directement sur voilà, cette slide-là. Alors, le commerce international, effectivement, et notamment le commerce interafricain, représente une réelle opportunité pour nos entreprises. C'est important de le dire. En plus de favoriser la croissance économique en exploitant les avantages comparatifs de chaque pays, il permet aux entreprises également d'accéder à des marchés beaucoup plus vastes, ce qui élargit leurs opportunités commerciales. Maintenant, ce même commerce international peut présenter quelques caractères complexes et compliqués et les expose à certains risques de non-conformité. 5 facteurs que j'ai essayé de mettre en lumière dans cette diapositive. Alors, le premier facteur, c'est les chaînes d'approvisionnement interconnectées qui s'étendent dans divers pays, donc dans le monde entier, et qui nous emmènent donc à passer différentes juridictions. Qui dit juridiction, dit réglementation et risque de sanctions internationales, effectivement. Il y a un autre facteur important qui est potentiellement une complicité entre l'importateur et l'exportateur et qui complexifie tout ce qui est détection justement de blanchiment de capitaux, de financement de terrorisme basé sur le commerce. Il y a également la diversité des biens et des services échangeables qui nous mettent en porte-à-faux parfois avec ce qu'on appelle les biens à double usage ou bien des biens tout simplement ou des services interdits par des politiques internes des établissements assujettis. Il y a également l'implication de nombreuses parties. Et là, on a ce fameux sujet de KYC, pas seulement sur notre client, mais également sur toutes ces parties avec lesquelles nous sommes indirectement en relation d'affaires et qui portent en elles-mêmes une exposition au risque. Et enfin, il y a la rapidité des transactions commerciales, qui est une évidence, on va dire, dans le commerce international, mais qui présente également un risque parce que ça peut être source d'une baisse de vigilance par rapport aux compliance officers. Ensuite, sur la slide suivante, j'ai essayé de vous montrer un peu ce que le GAFI pense du blanchiment des capitaux basé sur le commerce et du financement du terrorisme basé sur le commerce. Alors, le groupe d'action financière, mais également le groupe Egmont, ils ont rédigé un rapport, je pense, en fin 2021, intitulé Blanchiment des capitaux basés sur le commerce. Et il montre comment justement les transactions commerciales sont utilisées comme vecteur de facilitation du blanchiment des capitaux et du financement du terrorisme basé sur le commerce. Ils expliquent que ce BCC, on va l'appeler ainsi pour faire court, le premier but de ce BCC vise le mouvement délibéré de gains illicites par l'exploitation des transactions commerciales, tandis que sur le financement du commerce, du terrorisme basé sur le commerce, pardon, c'est la dissimulation du mouvement de la valeur en ayant recours également aux mêmes transactions commerciales. Et cela pour tenter de financer le terrorisme à partir de sources aussi bien légitimes qu'illégitimes. Donc, on se retrouve avec un commerce international et interafricain tout à fait légitime et louable, mais qui peut être utilisé comme vecteur de facilitation du BCC et du FTC. C'est à ce niveau-là que le compliance officer doit absolument intervenir pour protéger son établissement de crédit, sa banque de sanctions et d'éviter qu'elle puisse être justement une courroie de transmission pour le blanchiment des capitaux. Alors, sur la slide suivante, Francis, sur la slide suivante. La prochaine.
OK.
Pardon, Arnold. OK. Donc, sur ces slides-là, j'ai fait un tout petit focus, on va dire, sur deux éléments. Le compte courant et l'encaissement documentaire. Pourquoi? Parce que selon le GAFI, encore une fois, ce sont ces deux éléments qui sont les plus récurrents dans les analyses et les investigations du financement du terrorisme basé sur le commerce. Et pourquoi spécifiquement ces deux éléments? Le premier, au niveau du compte courant, en fait, on va dire que pour faire simple, le rôle des institutions financières sur la plupart des comptes courants est assez limité. C'est la méthode utilisée généralement dans les schémas de BCC parce que ils y exercent une surveillance un peu plus faible que pour les procédures d'encaissement documentaire. Ils peuvent avoir des difficultés, en fait, à apprécier, à évaluer de manière précise et cohérente la légitimité des opérations du client, que ce soit au moyen de leur outil de monitoring automatisé ou d'un dispositif de contrôle manuel. Une autre complexité qui s'y ajoute, ça peut être l'utilisation de tiers intermédiaires dans différents pays, qui peut faire aussi obstacle à tout ce qui est pratique de détection. En ce qui concerne les encaissements documentaires, où là, effectivement, les institutions financières ont un rôle un peu plus accru, on peut avoir une autre complexité, une autre limite, je dois dire, qui est la vérification qui n'est pas systématique des documents qui sont utilisés. Les documents ne sont pas toujours standardisés, ce qui permet donc justement, par le biais de fausses factures ou de factures fictives, de faciliter le BCC. Sur la slide suivante, je vous présente succinctement les principales typologies de risques que nous rencontrons dans nos zones, aussi bien UEMOA que CEMAC. Alors, qu'il s'agisse de simples paiements, de paiements documentaires ou de garanties internationales, il y a certaines techniques qui sont communes à la criminalité organisée. La première des techniques, c'est la surfacturation ou la sous-facturation. Alors, les biens commerciaux sont facturés à un prix inférieur ou supérieur au juste prix du marché. Et dans ce type de dispositif, en fait, la complicité de l'importateur et de l'exportateur est l'aspect essentiel qui rend le processus possible et difficilement détectable. Mais il y a encore des mesures de contrôle, justement en comparant les valeurs unitaires de ces biens ou de ces services-là sur des sites d'information. Il y a la facturation multiple. Au niveau de la facturation multiple, donc c'est plus d'une facture qui est utilisée dans l'opération commerciale, ce qui permet à l'auteur donc de l'infraction de justifier plusieurs paiements pour une même expédition. Donc, il utilise la même facture. Mais les criminels vont plus loin en utilisant ce mécanisme dans plusieurs institutions financières pour pouvoir complexifier encore plus la détection. Il y a troisième, on va dire, typologie, la surexpédition ou la sous-expédition, qui n'est pas très loin de l'expédition fictive aussi ou fantôme, où là, volontairement, on a une représentation erronée de la quantité des biens et des services, donc y compris les expéditions fictives, donc où il n'y a aucun bien qui est expédié, lors desquelles aucun produit injustement n'est véritablement déplacé. Ce processus repose également sur une bonne entente entre l'importateur et l'exportateur. Et enfin, nous avons une technique qui est l'opacité délibérée du type de marchandise, où là, vous avez une description fausse des biens ou des services qui sont concernés, tels que, par exemple, l'expédition d'un bien relativement peu onéreux, qui est décrit comme un article plus onéreux ou comme un article totalement différent pour justifier le mouvement de la valeur. Alors, quelles mesures de vigilance mettre en œuvre face à toute cette typologie de pratiques de BCC ou de FTC que nous rencontrons dans nos zones? Je vous en propose quelques-unes que j'ai résumées en deux catégories. Ce qu'on va appeler les mesures de vigilance standard et les mesures de vigilance renforcée. Au niveau des mesures de vigilance standard, elles se concentrent principalement sur la connaissance client, ce qu'on appelle encore le KYC. Sur la slide suivante, je reviendrai vraiment en détail, mais je vais m'appesantir sur le bénéficiaire effectif. Alors, dans toutes nos zones, ouest africaine et également au niveau de la CEMAC, nous avons une claire définition du bénéficiaire effectif qui peut aller avec des seuils de détection ou d'identification qui sont différents en fonction des zones. Je pense 25% en Afrique de l'Ouest et on parle plutôt 20% de l'autre côté, au niveau de la zone CEMAC. Donc la définition, elle, il n'y a pas de problème, elle est assez claire. Par contre, c'est assez difficile pour nous, banques qui sont dans ces régions-là, d'arriver à pouvoir identifier ces bénéficiaires effectifs à partir de la documentation qui est proposée par les clients. Nous avons une évolution législative assez récente dans nos zones, je crois à peu près 2 ans, entre 2 et 1 an pour certaines zones, où il a été créé donc le registre des bénéficiaires effectifs. Dans ce registre des bénéficiaires effectifs, il y a toutes les informations nécessaires, y compris celles des prête-noms, qui permettent justement aux banques de pouvoir identifier de manière sûre et certaine les bénéficiaires effectifs de toutes ces constructions juridiques ou personnes morales qui sont créées ou qui existent sur le territoire national. Par exemple, en Côte d'Ivoire, assez récemment, c'est une loi de juin 2024, je pense, qui portait création du registre des bénéficiaires effectifs et qui obligeait donc toutes ces parties-là à pouvoir faire la déclaration au greffe du tribunal, à pouvoir faire ces déclarations au greffe du tribunal. Pardon, excusez-moi, petit souci.
Genzo, you are on mute.
Madame Kada, vous m'écoutez?
Votre micro, on ne vous entend pas. On ne vous entend pas.
Ah, she's talking. Madame Kada, okay, let me...
En fait, votre micro est fermé, Madame Kada. Si vous pouvez ouvrir votre micro, on ne vous entend pas. Oui, là, on ne vous entend pas. Votre micro est fermé. Hmm.
Allô, Madame Kada?
Vous pouvez activer votre micro, s'il vous plaît.
Micro.
Ça paraît qu'il y a un problème technique avec elle. Peut-être on peut commencer avec les questions et après elle peut continuer.
OK. Donc, Madame Kada, si vous pouvez trouver peut-être de l'aide à votre niveau pour le micro. Oh,
Allô,
là,
allô?
voilà, c'est bon.
Ah oui, on vous écoute maintenant, votre micro était fermé.
Toutes mes excuses. J'ai eu un souci avec l'ordinateur. Il n'est pas très coopératif.
Non, c'est pas grave. Donc,
Toutes mes excuses.
pas de souci.
D'accord.
Vous pouvez
J'étais,
continuer.
je pense au niveau de la loi locale sur les bénéficiaires effectifs et notamment sur le registre des bénéficiaires effectifs en Côte d'Ivoire, qui a donc défini cette obligation-là pour toutes les nouvelles entreprises qui ont donc un délai d'une trentaine de jours pour pouvoir faire cette déclaration. Mais pour toutes les entités existantes, elles ont jusqu'à 1 an, ce qui ne règle pas entièrement le problème des compliance officers sur l'identification des bénéficiaires effectifs. Donc, je referme la parenthèse sur le BE. Donc, au titre des mesures de vigilance standard, nous avons donc globalement le KYC. Donc, la connaissance client qui recèle différents facteurs absolument importants et obligatoires à mettre en jeu. Alors, sur ce KYC-là, sur la slide suivante, j'ai essayé donc de vous préciser quelques éléments de ce KYC-là qui sont importants à mettre en place. Pourquoi est-ce qu'il est important de mettre en place ce KYC? Au-delà de l'obligation réglementaire, la commission bancaire des États de l'UOMOA d'ailleurs a remarqué, après une revue de l'ensemble des établissements et un questionnaire qu'elle a déroulé aussi sur l'ensemble de ces établissements, elle a présenté en novembre 2022 les résultats de ces contrôles et notamment sur le dispositif blanchiment. Elle a fait remarquer aux dirigeants des établissements de crédit qu'il y avait des insuffisances importantes, lacunaires, sur le dispositif de lutte contre le blanchiment de capitaux. Elle a pointé du doigt un élément très important, qui est la connaissance de la clientèle, qui n'était pas correctement assurée dans 94% des cas. 94% des cas, c'est énorme. Et elle a pointé du doigt l'absence de justificatif d'activité ou de revenus, des défauts sur la classification client, des défauts d'identification des BE et d'autres insuffisances encore. Donc, c'est pour ça que je vais m'appesantir un peu sur le KYC. Le KYC, ce n'est pas seulement de la collecte de documents, c'est de la cohérence des informations qui sont présentées dans ces documents. La connaissance client, ce n'est pas collecter juste un justificatif d'identité, de revenus ou de domicile. Et pour les entreprises, tout ce qui est structure actionnariale et autres. Non, c'est de s'assurer que ces informations sont cohérentes avec l'activité du client, avec l'objet de la relation d'affaires. Ces informations sont actualisées. Si on se contente de collecter des informations, des documents d'il y a 10 ans, qu'est-ce qui vous garantit qu'elles sont tout aussi pertinentes au moment de l'entrée en relation? alors que c'est au moment de l'entrée en relation que vous appréciez le profil du risque du client, donc l'exposition au risque de blanchiment que ce prospect-là présente. Donc, ce KYC, au-delà d'être complet, il doit être évidemment à jour. Cela concerne autant le dossier physique qui est collecté, mais également le système d'information. Le régulateur nous sensibilise énormément sur le fait que les informations doivent être déportées dans le système d'information, parce que cela sert énormément à autre chose. Au-delà des aspects opérationnels, donc la fluidité opérationnelle dans la prise de décision, il y a les aspects filtrage de toutes ces données qui sont collectées, mais il y a aussi les aspects profil du risque du client, mais également monitoring des transactions qui s'appuient sur les données qui sont dans le système d'information pour pouvoir vous présenter des alertes pertinentes. Donc, le KYC doit être effectivement complet et à jour. Dans ce KYC, notamment pour toutes ces personnes morales et ces constructions juridiques, on apprécie les pays avec lesquels notre client entre en relation d'affaires, va entrer en relation d'affaires, en tout cas si c'est une entité naissante ou est déjà en relation d'affaires. Pourquoi? Parce que ces pays-là présentent des risques de blanchiment ou des risques de corruption qui doivent être absolument appréciés par l'établissement avant son entrée en relation. Cette appréciation de ces pays va jouer dans la classification risque du pays. Et là, c'est la partie sur le profil risque du client. Le profil risque du client, c'est une donnée très importante qui fait appel à plusieurs facteurs réglementaires, tels que le risque du client lui-même, donc les facteurs spécifiques au client, mais également les risques géographiques, donc nationalité, résidence, résidence fiscale et tout ce qui s'ensuit. Les risques portés par les produits et services offerts aux clients, notamment donc tout ce qui est trade finance, qui sont des produits naturellement exposés au risque de blanchiment et de sanctions, donc à côté avec un risque moyen ou élevé en fonction de l'appétence au risque de l'établissement assujetti. Et le facteur réglementaire sur, par exemple, les canaux de distribution, c'est-à-dire comment est-ce qu'on on a présenté donc les produits ou l'onboarding au client, si c'est par le canal normal ou bien par le biais d'un intermédiaire. Donc, tous ces facteurs-là vous permettent, lorsqu'ils sont bien appréciés, et appréciés aussi selon une certaine fréquence en tenant compte des événements extérieurs et des avis des experts locaux, régionaux et internationaux, vous permettent d'avoir un profil risque client qui est à jour, qui est adapté et qui vous permet d'adresser les mesures de vigilance à un niveau standard ou à un niveau renforcé. Ensuite, sur la slide suivante, je vais m'appesantir un peu sur les mesures de vigilance à effectuer lors de la transaction même de trade finance. Alors, ces mesures de vigilance, on va dire dans le schéma de fonctionnement de ces transactions, il y a différents moments de vie, on va dire. Donc, à l'émission, s'il y a modification, bien au paiement, ce sont les cycles de vie en fonction de l'instrument qui est utilisé dans le commerce international. Les diligences doivent être accomplies à toutes ces phases-là parce que il peut y avoir des modifications qui interviennent entre deux phases et dont vous n'avez pas perçu ce changement-là et qui peut vous exposer à un risque de blanchiment ou de sanctions internationales. Donc, c'est pour ça que nous recommandons de faire ces diligences-là ou ces mesures de contrôle à toutes les phases. Ensuite, il faut vérifier les zones géographiques qui sont en jeu. Parce que, encore une fois, ça vous permet de détecter un risque de sanction ou un pays, on va dire, peu rigoureux en termes de blanchiment et de se poser les questions que vous voyez en bas. J'ai essayé de vous cibler quelques questions qui permettent d'éveiller le niveau de vigilance du compliance officer, notamment, par exemple, quels sont les pays qui sont impliqués dans l'opération? Aussi bien en envoi de marchandises ou en provenance de ce pays. Est-ce que ces pays, ce sont des pays à haut risque de blanchiment ou de financement du terrorisme, ou est-ce qu'ils sont situés dans une zone de libre-échange? Est-ce que les pays et les ports impliqués dans l'opération sont-ils un pays ou un territoire soumis à des sanctions internationales ou à des sanctions économiques de l'Union européenne, de l'OFAC et ainsi de suite. Cela vous permet de pouvoir ajuster votre dispositif de contrôle, de pouvoir collecter des informations additionnelles de sorte à être plus confortable avec la position que vous devez prendre sur cette transaction commerciale. Il faut contrôler toutes les parties prenantes. Au niveau des parties prenantes, il y en a une bonne liste que je vous ai mis, je pense, sur la dernière slide en annexe. Donc, ça concerne autant, je ne vais pas toutes les citer, hein, vous avez ça dans le support. Donc, tout ce qui est bénéficiaire, tout ce qui est partie destinataire, les expéditeurs, les bénéficiaires de garantie, s'il y en a, les garants des expéditeurs ou des destinataires, tout ce qui est tierce partie, tout ce qui est représentant mandataire, parce que toutes ces personnes-là, comme je le disais tantôt, vous mettent indirectement en risque parce que indirectement, vous entrez en relation d'affaires avec ces personnes-là. Ensuite, dernier élément, c'est de vérifier les moyens de transport. Alors, les moyens de transport, c'est tout ce qui est compagnie maritime, donc avion, port, on peut les vérifier auprès de l'Organisation maritime internationale. Il y a tout ce qui est numéro des navires aussi qu'on peut vérifier sur la liste OFAC ou bien sur des sites comme Vessel Tracker. Il y a tout ce qui est numéro de série du constructeur ou bien numéro de conteneur. Numéro de conteneur, effectivement, il y a des numéros de conteneurs qui sont donc sanctionnés, qui sont fichés. Et pour pouvoir détecter également les personnes, les pays qui sont concernés. Il faut s'assurer de vérifier le circuit de la marchandise sur l'hôte, par exemple, et le numéro de conteneur sur le BIC code. Ce sont quelques pistes ici qui vous permettent de pouvoir avoir une vision globale de votre opération commerciale et de vous positionner d'autant plus facilement sur le risque porté par celle-ci. Alors, dans les slides suivantes, je vous ai proposé également des questions à se poser.
Madame, est-ce que vous pouvez conclure en une minute possible?
Oui, je vais aller directement sur la dernière, enfin on va dire oui, la dernière slide par rapport aux pratiques pour renforcer le dispositif, ce que je propose. Un focus sur tout ce qui est formation et sensibilisation, pas seulement des équipes front et back office, mais également des équipes de conformité, que ce soit sur les risques blanchiment, mais également sur les nouvelles techniques de financement du commerce, afin que mutuellement, ils puissent apprendre et détecter plus facilement les risques. Il y a également une bonne pratique qui est d'effectuer un contrôle en amont au niveau des équipes back-office avec une fiche de contrôle qui peut être digitalisée pour pouvoir apprécier les risques de sanctions sur toutes les parties que j'ai évoquées tantôt. Et enfin, c'est d'améliorer le KYC et d'aller un peu plus loin avec la connaissance sur le bénéficiaire effectif de la contrepartie de votre client, parce que ce point d'attention-là est revenu assez souvent lors des RFI que nous avons rencontrés avec les banques correspondantes. Sur ce, je pense que je vais terminer. Ça sera mon dernier point, Francis. Merci de votre attention.
Merci beaucoup, merci beaucoup. Très bonne présentation. Qui détaille très bien aussi les risques de conformité les plus importants et fréquents dans la zone francophone ouest africaine et l'Afrique centrale. Nous ouvrons maintenant la session de questions-réponses. Malheureusement, nous n'avons pas beaucoup de temps. Nous avons encore un truc comme 7 minutes pour clôturer cette session. Donc, posez vos questions. Et j'aimerais déjà commencer avec la question du pôle, qui est étant donné les risques de conformité dont vous avez mentionné, s'il faudrait souligner le risque le plus important, quel serait ce risque? Et comment êtes-vous préparé à aborder ce risque de conformité dans votre structure? La question est posée à Madame Kada. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Francis. pour moi, le risque le plus important, c'est celui de blanchiment des capitaux, de financement terroriste. Et à l'intérieur, vous avez les failles que sont le défaut de KYC et la fraude documentaire, douanière et fiscale, notamment dans nos zones. Je pense que c'est ce qui émerge le plus. Alors, comment est-ce qu'on peut se préparer? C'est un des éléments que j'ai évoqué tantôt, c'est la connaissance du client dès l'entrée en relation et qui est maintenue tout au long de la relation et qui est adaptée en fonction de l'exposition au risque porté par les caractéristiques même du client, les pays avec lesquels ils nous mettent en interaction avec l'objet de sa relation d'affaires. Et puis, il faut un dispositif de contrôle à plusieurs niveaux. Déjà, on peut rencontrer malheureusement dans certains établissements assujettis un cadre normatif qui n'est pas suffisamment clair et qui ne fixe pas les responsabilités. Il faut absolument qu'il y ait cette base-là avec un cadre qui dit qui, quoi, quand et comment et qui permet à tout un chacun d'éviter des usages, mais de travailler selon une certaine méthodologie. Bien entendu, il fait tout ce qui est contrôle opérationnel, que ce soit intégré aux procédures, en lien avec les diligences que j'ai évoquées tantôt, mais également des contrôles a posteriori à effectuer par la deuxième ligne de défense. Donc, ça peut être le contrôle permanent ou le contrôle de la conformité. Et puis, il faut des outils de monitoring et de filtrage conformes à la réglementation et qui intègrent, notamment au niveau des outils de monitoring, des scénarios pertinents qui vous permettent de pouvoir détecter des opérations, qu'elles soient unitaires ou cumulées, en fonction du comportement du client, pour vous présenter justement des éléments vraiment pertinents. Donc, il faut travailler sur la qualité des scénarios à intégrer dans ces outils de monitoring-là et qui vont vous permettre de déceler justement par des règlements qui sont effectués de manière assez successive vers des pays à risque ou à destination, en provenance de pays à risque, ou des éléments, des transferts internationaux successifs suivis systématiquement de retrait qui peuvent être tout aussi successifs ou uniques. Donc, des outils donc, de monitoring qui sont à niveau. Des outils de filtrage aussi qui sont interconnectés avec des bases de données suffisamment complètes, intégrant toutes les listes de sanctions internationales, les listes de PPO ou des listes de personnes épinglées au titre de corruption, de blanchiment ou d'informations négatives, et qui permettent de pouvoir faire les filtrages conséquents sur toutes les parties prenantes que j'ai évoquées tantôt. Et dernier point, c'est sur la formation des acteurs, sur notamment les types de documents utilisés dans le commerce international. Il faut faire jouer la collaboration avec les autorités locales et notamment les services douaniers. Ceux-là, ils ont une connaissance approfondie de la scène du commerce international, des flux de biens et puis des chaînes d'approvisionnement. Il faut pouvoir les contacter pour pouvoir faire des formations afin que les équipes, que ce soit front, back ou compliance officer, puissent développer leurs capacités à ce niveau-là.
Merci. Non, merci beaucoup. Et je pense que 38% des participants sont d'accord avec vous. Ils soulignent aussi que le risque de blanchiment est le plus élevé. Maintenant, la deuxième question va à Madame Fungai. And the question is about how do you monitor transaction for suspicious activities? What measures are in place to report suspicious transaction to the relevant authorities?
You're on mute.
Your mic, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. In response to your question, I would rather say monitoring of suspicious transactions is a process which is supposed to be embraced by everyone in an organization, from first line of defense, since they have direct interface with the customers, to second line of defense as part of monitoring, and also third line of defense when the internal audit is assessing the control environment. So in my view, the process is both manual and automated. You can identify a suspicious transaction through interaction or through documentation review. and also automated through the various instruments that are implemented by organizations. For example, pre-processing monitoring, where the transactions are screened real time. You can also, they can generate alerts, and as a result, you can also form suspicion on the transaction after review. And then there is what is called post-processing transaction monitoring, where the transactions are reviewed over a period of time, and also alerts are generated for any anomalies. So in terms of measures in place, once a suspicion is formed, it must be escalated. Depending on the organizational infrastructure or processes, usually the expectation is the report must go to the compliance department. And I'm also aware a number of West Africa and Central Africa countries are connected to the Go AML, where they report the suspicious transactions to local regulators for further investigation. So as a bank, we are self-regulated, but we also participate in this process. As soon as we form a suspicion and it warrants reporting to the local FAIs, we do that exactly. And that's why we are signing memorandum of understanding with various local financial intelligence authorities. I hope I have answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Foley. Given the time, we just take the last question, and both speakers can share their view. And it's about, est-ce que le fait de transférer de l'argent auprès d'un pays non coopératif nous met dans un risque de blanchiment ou les pays à paradis fiscaux? I believe you got the question, Fungai, or do you want me to repeat? All right. So, peut-être, Madame Kada, vous pouvez donner votre point de vue et puis on va écouter.
Vous pouvez répéter la question? Je n'ai pas entendu le début, en fait.
La question essentiellement parle de est-ce que le transfert d'argent dans un pays qui est non coopératif ou dans un pays à paradis fiscal constitue un blanchiment d'argent?
En tout cas, l'exposition, en tout cas, est très forte. S'il est déjà épinglé comme pays favorisant le blanchiment des capitaux, ou en tout cas ayant un dispositif peu rigoureux, ou bien paradis fiscal, ça veut dire que dans votre système même d'information ou de monitoring, ça nécessite une vigilance beaucoup plus renforcée. Donc, plus de mesures de contrôle, plus de documents, plus de vérification. Ça peut aboutir à lever le blocage, donc à permettre au paiement de partir, mais ça signifie en tout cas que la vigilance doit être très renforcée.
Merci beaucoup. Please, Ms. Fungai, do you want to share your view?
Yes. Thank you. Quickly, yeah, I think it exposes to the risk of money laundering, given that the classification of a country being non-cooperative essentially means the controls that the regulatory framework is weak. So it's highly likely that some transactions might pass without being properly checked. So it's something that we need to seriously consider when we are processing trade finance transactions, because indeed it shows that the local regulatory environment is not as robust as expected by the global regulators. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just taking this opportunity to close the session. Thank you both for the very insightful discussion and presentation. I will now hand over to Ted for his conclusion remark. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, as we're almost over time, I'm going to keep my comments very short. I just want to say it's so interesting to see the 3 different sessions that we've had. They all cross over actually on the same issue, which is trust. We've talked about compliance. We've talked about fraud. We've talked about how technology can help automate. but it's all about how we can deliver trust. And certainly from the perspective of the second session, it is about how do you get digital trust out there? There are reasons that we have documentation and different blockages out there. We don't want fraud. We don't want money going out the door when there's no credit assessment, but we need to use technology to break that logjam. I think the second thing to say is the solutions that are on offer are really practical. We're not talking about generalities now. We're talking about you can get more working capital to the client. We're talking about you can reduce the number of false positives if you're looking for frauds from 95 in 100 to 5 in 100. We're talking about speeding up the payment cycle, which means you can do more trade finance as well. You can have repeat business, which is what we want for the banks and it's what we want for the clients. But I think the final point to make is just, it's about a change of mindset. As we heard in the discussions about compliance, where you have to have the correct approach to it, the same goes for digitalization. You have to accept there's a different way of doing things, and maybe some of the digital solutions you already have are actually the cause of the problems you have. Maybe you need to take a different approach. So changing mindset, that's the key thing. But I think today I was really encouraged by the crossover between the different things. Technology and a very strong compliance and risk understanding is the way to go forward. That's the way we can do business and get more clients out there and more trade finance. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ted. Colleague from Making Finance Work for Africa, please, if you could just proceed with your closing remark. Yes, Marina.
Merci beaucoup, Francis. Je vais m'exprimer en français. Je vais faire très, très court parce qu'effectivement, ça a été une matinée intense et donc je pense qu'il est temps de libérer nos participants pour un déjeuner bien mérité. Donc, juste quelques mots de remerciement. Donc, merci déjà à la Banque africaine de développement et à l'ITF de nous avoir associés à cet important séminaire qu'on était vraiment ravis d'organiser. Je pense que beaucoup des participants sont des réguliers des différents événements que nous organisons. Vous étiez plus de 300 à être avec nous aujourd'hui sur une session de plus de 4, donc je pense que c'est vraiment important de le souligner. J'espère vraiment que la session vous a été utile. Je pense que Ted a bien résumé les main takeaways. J'aimerais juste aussi souligner l'importance de partenariat et j'espère que vous avez vu tout au long de cette session qu'il y a des solutions pour adresser les différents défis qui ont été mentionnés, des solutions qui sont apportées par les différentes institutions présentes autour de la table aujourd'hui, la Banque africaine de développement, Afrixim et plein d'autres institutions. Et donc, c'est important que nous continuions de travailler ensemble pour trouver ces solutions et exploiter à plein les opportunités du financement du commerce en Afrique. Donc, je vous invite donc à consulter notre page, notre site Internet, à vous inscrire à notre newsletter pour avoir plus d'actualités et d'informations sur le développement du secteur financier, qui est donc notre mandat au sein de Making Finance Work for Africa. Et j'espère que nous aurons l'opportunité de continuer à avoir ces importantes discussions et de continuer à collaborer pour le développement du commerce en Afrique et pour le développement de la finance plus généralement sur le continent africain. Un grand merci encore pour votre présence et pour votre participation active et au plaisir de vous voir bientôt aux événements que nous organisons, soit physiquement ou virtuellement. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Marina. Merci à tous les participants, beaucoup plus à tous les conférenciers. Merci, Ted. Et voilà, comme nous avons indiqué, l'enregistrement sera partagé, y compris les différentes présentations, aussi de Making Finance Work for Africa. Merci beaucoup.
Merci tout le monde.
Merci à tous.
Thank you.